What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Yours Truly podcast. I'm your host, Christian Baxter, and today I'm talking with someone who's been orbiting this channel from the very beginning, long before I knew how any of this would actually take shape. Daniel from the OG Rose Cultural Project has been a steady presence in the comments from my earliest video. And over time, I've realized that his work sits right inside the same strange crossroads where my own project has been growing. If you've followed this channel, you'll know the terrain. People trying to think honestly about meaning, collapse, reconstruction, religion, philosophy, psychology, but doing it outside the universities for the most part, outside the old institutions in this new para-academic space that's formed around thinkers like Cadell Last, Paul Vanderklay, developmental integral theory, voice craft, conversation craft, the philosophy portal, Grail country, game A, game B, metamodernism, metagelicalism, this little corner of the internet. OG Rose has been in that mix from the start. Daniel and his wife, Michelle, have been collaborators with these and others for years, part of that ongoing attempt to name what's happening in our culture and what kind of people we have to become to live through it. I don't know all the details of their work, and honestly, part of the reason I wanted this conversation is because I wanted to hear it directly from Daniel, rather than trying to summarize it from a distance. What I do know is that whatever Daniel speaks, quite quickly I might add, he's working at the intersection of some tensions that animate this channel. The collapse of old certainties, the need for deeper forms of belonging, the recovery of meaning that isn't naive or nostalgic, and the recognition that the digital world is reshaping us faster than we can make sense of. So today isn't me presenting an expert, though I think he is. It's me sitting down with someone who's been building alongside the same people who have shaped my own thinking, someone whose work touches the edges of philosophy, psychology, and the theopoetics in ways that I've only begun to understand myself. Don't forget to like and subscribe for the channel's influence and become a channel member to financially support the work of this channel. And if listening on a pod, consider leaving a review. It would be very helpful. I'm genuinely looking forward to discovering more of who Daniel is and how his work fits into this wider ecosystem I've been tracing on this channel in this little corner of the internet. So without further delay, I give you Daniel of OG Rose. Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud. Rolling. All right, we're recording here with Daniel from OG Rose, and as we were talking backstage, Daniel or OG Rose commented on my very first YouTube video that it came into his algo. There was a connection. I didn't know what was going on at that. That was almost 2 years ago. 400 videos ago or something like that, and so, but there's been kind of seeing the way things work on the internet and in this space with X, Twitter, and other comments, and seeing other videos, seeing Daniel in his collaborations with places like Philosophy Portal with Cadell Last and Voicecraft with Tim Alladin and other in their own spaces, and so that's in kind of this question we're entering into. Well, it seems like a necessity for new meaning makers, as there's been kind of in this corner of the internet, and it broadly, widely, and deeply impacted by kind of the Peterson phenomenon coming postmodernism, woke, all that stuff, reshaping the conversation. We're now almost around 10 years into that. And so, but before we kind of get into that, I personally want to know more about Daniel, just like their story. It's kind of, when you've got all this content and all this stuff, it's hard to know you're coming in this digital conversation at different places. I don't really know what made OG Rose initially or what made him as a person. And so I would just be interested to start by hearing about where'd you grow up? What kind of environment shaped you early on?
Well, that is a fantastic question. And Christian Baxter, it is a thrill to speak with you. I am so happy to have this chance. So thank you for having me. And what a wonderful question. And yes, that kind of movement online, as odd as it can be, I think actually creates a lot of possibility, hope, and new ways for us to exist in the world in a manner that actually can humanize us in our communities, in their very difference, if we just learn to yield it properly, which is, of course, easier said than done. But I think that's part of the moment. So I'm in Virginia. I grew up on a Black Angus farm next to my grandparents. Would sit on the porch, and we're still there in that area, so it's a lot of fun. And we have 4 children. I'm married to Michelle. So Opperman Garner Rose. So that means Opperman Garner Rose because we put our names together in 2011. It's a pen name. Mostly our work starts in fiction, short stories, novel writing, things like that, Under the Wing, To Turn the World Blackout, The Savior, etc. I could go on. A lot of work in fiction. And then on the side, you're also doing philosophy in order to have the ideas that you're going to, in a sense, hide in the fiction. Like you do a whole lot of work thinking over here to have something not to show in the fiction that nevertheless, every time the characters move, they're participating in that thing. Right. So those kind of, I'm more than happy to talk about how for us, philosophy and art relate, theology, art, because I think that's a huge topic, because they're very dangerous to do together because philosophy can destroy the art. But philosophy without art also dies because there's something about art and the creative act, as someone like a Burjayev or Rookmacher, et cetera, will talk about, that actually brings it into the realm of people and community and possibility. So you have to do both, but there's an interesting relationship that has to be thought there. But anyway, Opperman Garner Rose, also our God Rose. We came up with the name on the back of Eunoia, which was a community I helped run called that's interested in beautiful thinking. What does the gospel compel you to do as an artist? So that was in the college realm, but I grew up on a farm. Spent childhood lost in the woods. I had a photography business for about 15 or so years called Frozen Glory Photography. So lots of did pictures, did weddings, did that for a long time. I sat in a diner with old men every Friday, Mr. Dillard, where we just met and talked. So, I was very fortunate to have that. I did that, Frozen Glory, worked on a science fiction series, Sort of Tribulation. And so, yeah, that's kind of to throw that out there to start there. And I'm happy to go into detail on any of that. But that's some of it.
So you touched on, is this dispensational theology that was formulating the tribulation, or what was that? What was the connection to that? That's stuck out to me.
That's really funny. No, it was just, it sounded cool, but I'd like to say that my little 11th grade brain went dispositional. That's it. This is Book of Revelation, baby. That was probably in the air because it's Lynchburg, Virginia. And, we're in the circuit with Falwell and Thomas Road, and that was part of the community. And Mr. Dillard actually helped start that church with Falwell and all of those, and Liberty's right down the road. So that was probably in the subconscious zeitgeist. But really, it was a sword that if good gets it, it saves the world. And if bad gets it, it destroys the world. And the bad guy gets to recreate the world in a new way. But what happens is there's a nuclear apocalypse. So they want to recreate the world. So a good guy has to get the bad sword. But then that's a good motive. And it creates a tension for him. So that was kind of the premise of it. So I worked on that for a lot of years.
Well, that makes sense of why you have, I'm a very novice top of the water when it comes to philosophy and the understandings. I operate just like on the memes of these guys, Hegelian synthesis, but that's kind of what that, it speaks to. And that was forming you at an early age, high school, that kind of, and, Cadell's talked about with Peter Rollins, the Church of the Contradiction, and that, so that was within your imagination. You said that was when you're in high school.
Yeah. The Sort of Tribulation started when, so usually people who got really lucky had a really good English teacher somewhere who said something nice about something they wrote, and it had a big impact on it. So, the good English teacher, but somewhere in the sixth grade, Miss Sanborn had us write a story, and that's when I started it. And she said, that's really interesting. And so just kept doing it for 11 or so years, from sixth grade to, yeah, to college, UVA. And then I found out, because I guess I also, let's see, I think I was oblivious. Like I was oblivious about a few things. First, I just grew up basically talking ideas with Mr. Dillard, Mr. Chapman, and my grandpa. I never thought about it as philosophy. I just thought about it as talking. But then when I kind of, and like JB Potter and I would walk around and talk in high school, I did wrestling, cross country, things like that. I never really thought of it as philosophy. It's just like one thing leads to the other. And if you're going to talk about freedom in America, well, then what is freedom? It wasn't I didn't think of it as a philosophical move. It's just like, well, what is that? Right. But then when I get like outside and I suppose the wider world, Country Bumpkin goes to Charlottesville, when people are like, oh, you like philosophy? What? What's that? Oh, that stuff you're doing. Oh, really? So there was kind of that. Also, too, I suppose, it seemed to me as if, not that I really called them philosophical problems, I thought of them more as just quandaries or tensions or things with stakes. It just seemed to me that story that lacked philosophy lacked something, actually. It lacked depth, and it didn't relate. Like there seemed to be a lot of stories that were trying to emotionally resonate where you as a reader saw yourself in it. But that seemed very different from the storytelling and art that I was interested in, which kind of framed a cosmic tension that everyone was caught up in and nobody knew the answer to. Because that seemed to actually be truer to life, actually. Like those are the kind of things that actually the great stakes arise in. And philosophy and theology just seem to be actually when you frame those things. So yes, I from an early age, just because I was very fortunate to have basically older men who just did this every morning at the Big T over their sausage gravy. And then also in story writing, it just kind of all came together. And then later on, you're like, oh, I guess that means you like philosophy and theology. But it was more of just a natural sort of where things lead, etc. For me, at least.
Yeah, the conversation, conversation, and the taking that all the way back to Socrates or something like that. But like that's just been going on. And that was actually when I went to Symbolic World a couple years ago now, and I met Nate Heil from Grail Country there. I was so, everything was just coming at me so fast, and where I was embodying a lot of just this kind of digital apparatus was coming into physical space. And he said, yeah, this is being a part of the conversation. And I was like, oh, there's something to that. And in that same conversation that the men are having over, politics and religion at the diner, is still that conversation. It's really interesting. We were talking backstage. Like I had grew up in a very small rural town in Arkansas where you see old men at the country store, shooting the bull and whatever. And we did 60 head of cattle when I was a kid because my dad was trying to restart the farm because of he grew up on this farm that we grew up on. So it's like a kindred in that nature, hearing that. So talking about philosophy and conversation and kind of discovering that, what was the you said you went to UVA. Is that where you went to your undergrad? Like what did you study and what did that kind of spark within you? What did you find in that space?
Great question. So first off, I think I would note that I do think the separation of philosophy from conversation has been one of the reasons why certainly when I was in college in 2010, it basically was over in people's minds. Philosophy was basically trolley problem experiments in the history of philosophy, right? Like the spirit of philosophy was very dead. Well, to be charitable to someone like Derrida on grammatology, I think basically when he's critiquing philosophy as the written word, I think basically instead of deconstructing the whole, that should point us back to philosophy as the living word in conversation, right? But also problematically, philosophy greatly suffered because people were under a correspondence theory of truth, meaning that when I talk to you, I'm trying to verify you say true things as opposed to getting taken up in the spirit of the discussion. There's no way for philosophy to be in the correct spirit except in what, Vervaeke calls dialogos, right? This sort of similar form, following, etc., right? Basically, for most of what college, in my opinion, mostly what many universities teach is the history of philosophy and the history of ideas, but not how you yourself can actually philosophically reason, because that would require a certain disposition and discussion and openness, etc., so forth. So that's been a major problem.
that makes me think about the end of history.
Fukuyama.
Yeah, that spirit of we're just looking at philosophy now because we've kind of come to the end of history. That was still, that meme was very powerful even in 2010s in the universities, and even just from my understanding, I had this similar conversation with a guy named Justin Wells, who's a filmmaker in the corner, and he said the same thing. Is he was like excited to get to study philosophy, and it ended up being a lot of about philosophy, not like the practice of philosophy. We weren't doing philosophy, and a lot of that comes through like, well, ideas are actually dangerous, and it seemed like the university was only concerned about ideology, like aimed at an ideology versus, not only, but in a general sense, as opposed to some kind of dialogue within that space that had originally been intended for, I think, for my cursory understandings of the academy and that type of ideas. So
I think that's exactly right. I think basically there was an understanding, especially before 2008, and then so it started to crack, obviously 2001, 2008, 2016, 20, COVID, etc. Those were in the cracks, and now we have what we have now, which is a feeling that quote unquote liberalism, however one defines that, has failed, and you have these post-liberal forces that are taking over, critiquing neoliberalism, capitalism, etc. Right. So, but there was certainly in the early 2000s and 2010s a certain notion of, we basically have reached the best thing, and all we need to do is certify that you're on board with the program, that you get it. So any ideas that aren't part of the program, that's how you fail the test, and we're verifying you. Right. There's a way in which certification actually became verification, that we can verify you're part of the program, and thus you're certified. Right. Well, that I think has led to some backlash we are now seeing, because people are like, I don't agree with the idea that I am only certified to be part of the middle class if you verify that my ideology matches yours, right? And that leads to all sorts of problems. So, Francis, it's also interesting with Fukuyama, and then I'll talk about UVA. With Fukuyama, I actually think the most revealing book of his, and the great Raymond talks about the Owen and the Agon, is his book on bioethics, where he's basically looking ahead to CRISPR, he's looking ahead to gene editings, and very interesting in the book, he basically says this: we need to return to first principles, meaning like, Thomas Nagel says there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. And so like Francis Fukuyama is like, we need to go back to owning first principles and a view from somewhere, et cetera. So, but you want to say, but Francis, buddy, the whole idea of the end of history is moving beyond ideology, right? Like it's the end of first principles. It's not, we don't need to have those discussions anymore, I thought, right? And this would be a larger discussion. Basically, I think Fukuyama would reply, he would say, no, I'm not saying people in democracy don't have different first principles. I'm saying that we separate the market and ideology, and we have small government, libertarianism, et cetera, so forth, and we have the first principles over here, et cetera, so forth. Here would be a giant claim I'd have to justify. The reason why, although that is internally consistent, the mistake is believing that politics and economics can be separated. That's the libertarian dream. That's why the reason why liberalism has failed, although I actually don't think the liberalism that everyone like Nick Land or Dugan is critiquing is actually the classical Russell Kirk liberalism that I'd have. Like there's Ruskin, Murr, No Place for Grace, etc. Like there's many things here. But basically, you could say that liberalism and even modern conservatism fell into the mistake of separating politics and economics. When Marx was correct about this, it's always political economy. There is no such separation of it. Because like you can kind of say, there's a lot of people that will say, to my great sympathy, I will get to the UVA, I promise.
That's
to the great.
I mean, we're talking, this is the meta reality of the university, so it's okay. I mean, we're kind of still
perfect. See, it's all actually latent in it. Fantastic. Is that basically there's this idea of I don't want anything to do with politics, and I would actually argue when Cadell's talking about the theopolitical, it's this point. Well, I don't either, but the problem is if I have a job, I'm politically involved. Like if you go to work, you're actually involved in politics. Because often when we say I'm not involved in politics, what we mean is I'm not going to bring in Trump. I'm not going to bring in abortion. I'm not going to bring in the war in Iraq. Yeah, but politics sets trade, agreements.
Commerce.
They set commerce. They set your tax rate. They determine your property tax. They determine if there's going to be a data center nearby. This is called Planier and the Great Transformation. If you're participating in the economy, you're always already political. And the problem is, if you realize that, and you're not ready for that, then you blow up and you get the popularist backlash that we're seeing all around the world, right? So the problem is that generally conservatism fell into that. I remember, and you probably remember this as well, there was a period in the 2010s where basically everyone was like, conservatism's over and now libertarianism's going to prevail, right?
Yeah.
There was this big Paul, all of these different people, and then kind of mysteriously, now everyone laughs at libertarianism. Like, it's not even
it was kind of the code for, like, you were trying to, you couldn't say you were conservative, but you could get away with in saying you were libertarian. I feel like that was like, that's pushing the lead, more to the center or something like that. Yep. And that's the sense that I had, I can say that and still kind of get away with some, well, I'm going to choose my conservative values, but I'm libertarian. And yeah, it feels like a cop-out in a little ways at this point, like you're saying, the critique upon it. And so, but the other piece that you were going into with the breaks, but also just the general milieu at the time was that so going back to talk about the philosophy being kind of a given, or it being the history of philosophy or something like that, makes me think about, and where Jordan Peterson came into the conversation, because even in, and I'm not going to get into the details of this, but in my own life, being a part of, small institutions locally, I noticed that when they forgot why they even existed, like churches, not even really knowing why they exist, like their narrative history. And even if that's 20 years, I watched it all just kind of like, you're just kind of existing and being, driven by these, spirits or egregores or the age of that type of thing. When you detach from your myth, from your narrative, from the history, like not just a mythic history, but also like a physical history, or a remembered history of, like I said, 20 years. And it seemed like, okay, well, in the end of history, mid 90s to 2015, there was like this a great amnesia or something, like, oh, well, we got to go back to first principles because we've actually forgot why we're here, in a sense, and we can just put all these abstractions on top of it, the woke stuff that then got built on top of it as like kind of abstractions. Seems like, I don't know, that's what that's kind of bringing out for me in that.
I agree with all of that. And basically, again, the idea of the end of history is tied to all the, there were all these religious wars in Europe where people fought. Then we had the Enlightenment. And basically there's this notion that liberal democracy, the Washington Consensus, there's different ways to discuss what Francis Fukuyama was discussing. Probably neoliberalism could be a problematic term because it's often a slur, but it also does refer to a real thing, which is the Washington Consensus, and basically the idea of democracy, markets, and free markets, democratic nations, war in Iraq, blah, blah, blah kind of thing, right? In many respects, there's a sense in which, although Francis Fukuyama said history ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there's a way in which Iraq and the Middle East was a continuation of the logic of the Cold War, because you're trying to extend capital markets, you're trying to extend capitalism. It wasn't fighting communism, but it was actually kind of post-Cold War. The logic of it was a post-Cold War. And actually, you could argue that this would be a larger argument. You could basically say the entire 20th century is just a continuation of World War I, that it all just goes on. And the reason why a lot of people, boomer is now another kind of term. You're not, that's a bad term. You're a boomer or whatever, right? There's a notion in which the boomer is a continuation of post-Cold War thinking, like the continuation of the Cold War, the shadow of Buddha, as Nietzsche may say. Just the Cold War never left us, that kind of project. And there's a lot of people who are like, but that's false. That it doesn't work that way, because the Washington Consensus makes the mistake of believing politics and economics can be separated. And when there's only ever political economy. And let me explain what I mean by that. Oh, and then of course it's wild to think that World War I made the entire world, because when you ask people what started World War I, they're like, I don't know. Guns of August, it's a mysterious sort of, something just happened, and like it's like a force got out of people's control, almost like Nick Land's Techno Cthulhu kind of AI game theory stuff. That's been going on since World War I. Anyway, the reason why politics and economics cannot be separated is, and this is where the sociologists like Berger and Hunter and Philip Reef and all of these cats, they say, because and actually James K. Smith is quite good on this. And his Desiring the Kingdom, You Are What You Love. And he has that idea that when you go on to the mall, what is it doing? It's working on your habits. It's working on what you love. Like society works on your habits. Okay. So here's the issue. The kind of job you have, which is determined by what the politics allow. Like this is very important. It's really hard to start an entrepreneurship that is serving food to people. The regulations, the certification is really high. And what people don't understand is you're like, well, my job has nothing to do with politics. Yeah, but the kind of jobs you're able to do to make money are actually set by the regulatory and certification body that the politics sanction, right? And this gets into Ivan Illich, who's someone Michelle and I have taught on, and we think very highly of Ivan Illich. And he's all about this regime of certification that limits the kind of jobs you can have. And here's something very important. To limit the kind of jobs people can have is to set the kind of habits they can form, because your habits are going to be determined by what you're allowed to do. And your habits are subconscious. And here's the issue, okay? You can argue that under capitalism, you get into a habit of thinking of things in terms of quantity, exchangeability, and abstraction, right? And pragmatism. Like people could look at us right now and say, why are you doing this? You're not getting what to do it? Paid. So it's what? Irrational to do, right? And most people down the street are like, why are you reading philosophy unless you're going to get a job, get paid for it? So it's not quantifiable, right? The average person in the society, because of the economy, have been trained into habits of understanding what's worth doing and what's not worth doing by their job, which then impacts what they vote for in the political body, what issues they care about, who represents them. And then those people set terms that further sets the economic structure, and you get a feedback loop, right? And you see that is what, and if you don't realize that, which I would argue conservatism's downfall, and I do think it's been its downfall, has been forgetting that reality, not understanding that you're always liturgical. You are always being shaped by your environments and I'll stop here, in the very way you interpret reality. Here's the problem. Your horizon, they say, no, the name of the game is to set people free. The choices you consider to pick in your freedom is determined by the horizon you have been habituated into by your embodied everyday living that you subconsciously that you're shaped by on the subconscious level, right? And if you're not aware of that, then you're going to actually be not your own. You're not going to be your own. You're not going to form your own personhood. You are simply going to be fungible, as Marx would say, or participate in the machine. But I'll pause there.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is another kind of the personal question that I'm interested, because in the spaces that you have inhabited that I've seen you in are mainly, I mean, I don't have a better word, but kind of secular philosophical spaces. Mm-hmm. But you come across to me like I hear Bonhoeffer, I hear very familiar with evangelical substructure with Liberty University. And what is your kind of religious makeup, and how are you participating in that now? Because you mentioned, J.K. Smith, and you're talking about being formed by liturgy. And I want to talk about that related to the subconscious, related to the digital reclaiming the medieval, even in that idea of how we're being formed, and scroll and doom scroll and all these things. So I'm curious on those points.
Well, if I would just throw out a few quotes, so if I just kind of, without thinking too hard about it, throw out quotes that I think were really formative on a subconscious level, is Hans Ruckmacher, whose book is very important on modern art. Michelle has done a bunch of speeches on it, talks on it. We talked about it a lot. It was formative for Eunoia. He has that line where he says, Jesus did not come to make people Christian. He came to make them fully human. And you go, ooh, that's nice. Now, of course, there's a ditch on both sides. You can take that too far, right? But it's this idea of, yeah, I guess Christ did come to make all things new, right? And for me, also, I never bought into the split between church and culture. Like this idea that these things are split, like that's not true. And also, when you look at the history, you're like, it doesn't seem to me as if a division between culture, like philosophy and theology, that seems to be a modern invention. Like no one seems to have believed in that. Like the people like Aquinas or John Scott, they're just going between the waters very easily. I never really thought much about like theology over here, society over there. I thought of them kind of all together, really. I will also say that as just a note, I have notably since 2016, 2015, once you kind of had obviously the political landscape shift with Trump, and also I've been heavily involved in Pentecostal churches and just seeing how they were pulled into a certain political ideology, Cyrus theology. There was a certain notion of, oh man, we have no way to stop this kind of thing or to even think this kind of thing. There's a lack of self-defense. There's a lack of even knowing how to think about it. And also that nihilism you were talking about with Ross on basically everyone is a sinner, that actually can be used to make you very manipulatable for power,
Yes.
right? And, and I'm not trying to say that, like someone like Trump is bad and not Trump is good, but just not even the ability to think it, right?
Yeah.
Just getting swept along. That was a very big red flag. Also, too, honestly, I have one of the reasons I've gotten so much into secular philosophy, economics. I also did a lot in economics. I think very highly, like a solo. I can go. The debate between Keynes and Hayek is actually really important. Mensis, etc. In critiques of equilibrium in favor of reflexivity, blah blah blah. But basically, I'm of the opinion that neither Protestants, Catholics, or Orthodox have a sufficient theology of political economy by which to actually deal with our present moment. And actually, if all of the three of them kind of own that, I think that can be a kind of way to have an inter-religious discussion, right? Because when you ask which of those is right, then you get into trouble when you say, well, actually, we're all pretty weak when it comes to the theopolitical. So let's try to think that together. That can be the humbling that can create the condition of possibility for new theology, actually, that I think is really needed today. I think also because I primarily started and identify more as an artist. I teach piano, music, open mics. The artist, I suppose, when you're creating a story, like you're telling a story about the world and what's in it. And that involves, there's not clean lines between politics, economics, church. A person, a good story that's centered on a person is going to be an individual moving between all of those waters, right? And so thinking all of those things was actually necessary to create, well, a real person, because a real person deals with all of those things.
That's right.
Yeah. I think that is another reason why, like, I never thought of it as leaving Christianity to study economics or leaving theology. I just saw it as all part of creation and incarnational thought. So that's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I really, in my own personal story related to like a destruction of my life and being my humanity in so many ways being brought very low, where all the structures that had all those categories had been put together. I was listening to you have that conversation with Cadell of his book Real Speculations from about 6 months ago, and talking about, I guess it was, you can correct me if wrong, but was it Derrida who was talking about deconstruction, or was it Foucault?
Mostly Derrida.
Yes. Yeah. And you made the statement of something like, we have that term entered into the kind of religious landscape, 5-6 years ago as a kind of like, what do I do with all my woke, quote unquote, non-religious ideology now with my conservative evangelical upbringing? There wasn't, it's just like, I'm back to zero. That wasn't really what happened to me was not related to that. I was tracking the political contours related to those things because I was at a conservative church. And how are we going to wrestle with what's so powerful in the culture, circa 2010 to 2019 or whatever. And so it's like, but instead I kind of got just like, I've got put into this meta perspective on church because I'm going back to it, but I'm just completely on the very edge of it instead of being like, and so that really, and reclaiming myself as a human, even, and in some of that conversation with Ross Bird, we get into pieces of that as well, but trying then to, you don't fit neatly into any of these boxes. And it did push me into the philosophical because I started looking at how basically from a liturgical and a worship leader perspective, like think you're Chris Tomlin to to Hillsong. I don't know if you're familiar with those categories, but like, oh, so I'm looking at them now as an observer, not from within, but understanding from what it was like to be within that, and then being exposed well, I'd been on a journey with looking at like the high church stuff since I married a Catholic Lutheran family, and so and that was in like 2007. So those things were going along as well, and so to get into this, I'm looking where I've been now is looking at liturgy, looking at the embodiment of, because that's been more of the specialty, and if I have a specialist area, the looking at worship teleologically and ontologically, and then the epistemology is the stuff that gets argued about all the time. But really, because this is what we're talking about with the economic side of it, is like, well, if we can get a shared economic teleology or an ontology that we could work with together, and I kind of see that in a sense within, there are elements, and of course the theology is like the propositional ideas about what's taking place within these things, but the practice is ontological and teleological. Is you have this baseline ground of everything of our understanding God, Christian, you're going to have Christ. What are we doing in worship is like our point, and what we decide, all those things inside of there, the specifics. But if we understand that we're actually in parallel doing these things together teleologically, that's pushed me into from the theological more into the philosophical, because I watch a lot of these young guys. I watch, see this new generation of apologetic culture, a new generation of, I talk about Redeemed Zoomer all the time, because it's just fascinating, because it's also coming into contact with the kind of culture, the 4chan culture, in a sense, that has sprung up at the same time. And so that's interesting sociologically, but not as much theologically for me. And so I don't feel at home. So I really resonate with what you're saying, like finding, and on the economic side of it, I got into kind of looking at Bitcoin because of YouTube, and looking at, the Keynes. I don't know if you say it was Keynes or Keynesian economics. And then there's the, what's the one from Austrian, from the Netherlands or whatever. I was like, and then getting kind of foundational understandings there related to ideas about trust. You can go into the narrative theological, you can go into Judas and Christ, and then I feel like the shared purse. There's all sorts of interesting things related to church that just get further and further pushed into abstraction, into the systems that we're in, related to even this is a small point, but like I noticed this as I began to like work with little traditional liturgies again, was like, oh, we used to have a passing of the offering plate where physical money was put into, and it was a time of worship. And now it's like, well, what people are going to forget their money, so we need to make sure they do the QR code, or they're going to, and it's like this giving, let's put it on auto. And that is now it's not an act in a sense, and it's just all happening in the level of abstraction. So I see these things even within liturgical practice. You talk about habits, and you talk about why we need to slow down, and like how many kids have never seen an offering plate passed, and in that. And I'm not trying to be some like, we need to do it like the old people did it. It's a psychological, it's a habitual liturgical thing that I'm realizing is important, that we just so easily tick off into, an economic. Well, we just need to make sure we get the metric. We need to make sure we, that type of thing. So there's a lot there, but I'm dancing with you on that.
But you're getting at all the really important stuff. So, very, very well said. So I also just say on my background, grew up maybe going to a small Methodist church just because that's where the parents went. Providence, Hughes was there. Then when I got to high school, I was like, "What? You can drive places." I was saying this to Ken, and it's like there's Highland Heights. I did go to Thomas Road. I went to different churches. Probably went to Highland the most, and I went to college. I was involved in Chi Alpha and InterVarsity, but the one I landed on a lot was the Baptist Collegiate Ministry, because the building was going out. They were going to sell it and get rid of it. And basically we came in and we're like, the thing that was a through line was what is the relationship between Christianity and creativity? And basically Eunoia, when we, Nicole and Win Collier was as a he actually wrote an amazing biography on Eugene Peterson. He's a wonderful individual. And then we brought in Evan and Bernard, and I know I'm just throwing out names, but we had it started as a conversation. What if we were to do a ministry that was really interested in the question, what does the gospel compel you to do as an artist? And that became kind of and we also did sexually broken, because there was a lot of human trafficking going through. I'm friends with Corbin Addison, who wrote a book on this. The intellectuals, kind of thinking, because the New Age atheism, but apologetics, and there was something true about that, but problematic about that, and thinking through that, and then creativity. And the idea was beautiful thinking has something to do with those things together, and kind of unfolding what that meant. So then, worked there, 2000, Sexton, worked ministry, had classes, did open mics every Thursday, probably 2008 to 2014 before coming down here to Lynchburg. So did that for a long time. And
that was through the BCM? Is that what
that was
saying?
through Baptist Collegiate Ministry. Yeah. It was in Virginia. So did that. And that was a wonderful thing. And so that, I would say, if I were to just kind of throw out a kind of background, the other thing too is, my time at UVA, honestly, I was pretty pissed at my first year, in the sense of, I'm like, this is stupid and lame and nobody, like, it really kind of in a sense of, this is dumb. Like, I hate to say it that way, but the structure of the classes is like, if you write anything, I guess I was just really stupid in the sense of, I had no sense that you're supposed to write what the professor wants you to say, what they think. I had no sense of this. I had no sense of the TA getting mad if you didn't write on what they liked. And so that happened. And it was such, I suppose, kind of what? Like, I had
the same experience. I wasn't a good writer, but I actually had this. I got into church history, and it was our hardest class in the undergrad, one of the harder classes. And I thought I was trying to be creative, or I thought I was supposed to come up with what I'm experiencing. And then I was like, if I will just try to regurgitate, that was like a revelation to me, in a sense that it didn't seem natural. It didn't hit me as that's the natural thing that you were supposed to be doing.
No. So I was mad. I was ready to leave because and really what ended up happening is three things. One, Eunoia. So that was there. But that was I was still kind of leaving. I joined the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society, which was a very big deal and still is a very big deal because of Dr. Howard told me about it. And that was a place of discussing ideas. Literary debate, it's the oldest literary and debating society, continual literary and debating society. So that was a very big deal, because what ended up happening is I ended up finding people like Paul and Vincent who are like, oh, these people like like online, all these people who just talk about ideas and are interested in this thing. I found people who did that, like a high concentration. So I'm like, that makes this valuable, who are thinking beyond the classroom, because truth, goodness, and beauty matter, dang it. And we should think about it for its own sake. And because there are stakes, there are real stakes. Like, if you don't think beauty in your life and you're not able to really understand how important it is, then you won't experience it, and you won't know you don't experience it. So you won't know you're missing anything. Like, that's always the horror. That's the Lewis, hell's locked from the inside. If you don't know, you don't know. You also don't know, you don't know. And so you're damned. So it's really important to continually keep yourself from that enclosure, right? So these people were alive on that. And then I had the beloved and fantastic, wonderful William Wilson, who taught a class on Christian vision and literature. And he saw me walking by. I was like, Daniel, come on in. He called me from the way. He's like, come on in. He's like, what's wrong? And I'm like, I'm pissed. He's like, why are you pissed, Dan? I was like, because this is stupid. And he was like, yeah, because he's retired now because of the similar sort of force. He's like, yeah. But he's like, why don't we just do some classes? And so basically I took every class he did. Christian vision and literature, Faulkner in the Bible, Platonic theology, Platonic philosophical theology, Aristotle, I just took whatever he took, Walker Percy. And then his really good friend, Vigan Guroyan, who actually was, he's been doing studies on East Orthodox, fairy tales, Snow White, Brothers Grimm. He's kind of a world expert on child literature, vegan Goroyan. He's a tremendous gardener, kind of Pajot before I knew about Pajot. I think he did a lot to bring over people like Berjayev, translate these texts, like to get on the publishing. So he was a lot before Orthodoxy blew up, really. I mean, he was a good friend. I saw him a few months ago. He's a wonderful individual. So I also just found some people, and then it's like, well, let me just take these classes with these people. And that made it a good experience. But there was a period in there where I was pretty pissed off. And then there were other great professors like Ken Elzinga, the great Nemec. I did a lot in Hinduism, Sufism, Wolford. I can go on. So I had these different experiences. Worked at a literary journal, Wide Awake. So that's all kind of there. And I did get very fortunate. My father was also a tremendous facilitator of discussion. We would stand at the garage and talk. He was a football coach, tremendous football coach, athletic, but also a conversationalist. And we would just stand at the garage. And something he did tell me that was a big deal. And then all the stuff on apologetics, I will say, and we can get to, because that's so important. I'll pause after this point, though, is that he did tell me, he said, don't forget, Daniel, the most important stuff at college is what happens outside the classroom. That was a huge deal, because then it's like, actually, I need to focus on people like Vincent or Paul or Bernard or Betsy. I can go on outside the classroom who have these kind of philosophical friendships. Not that I thought about them that way, but they had this center of the good, beautiful, and the true. And Jockin has put that as, and it actually is. Friendship's actually an unbelievably important concept in philosophy, and it's been lost, phileo in theology as well. But so I had that kind of sense that actually when you go to college, it's more about the people than it is the grades in the classroom. And that has actually turned out to be unbelievably true, because many of these relationships you still have, they've still impacted you. But critically too, what for me was outside of the classroom was not opposed to learning. It's actually where more learning occurred. And this is very important. So these spaces I was in outside of the classroom, it wasn't like, I don't care about education, I don't care about learning. It actually was where the highest quality, more dialogos, more actual learning occurred. And that's why that was also a big deal for me, because it actually unveiled, oh, wait, what most people call education and learning is actually not education and learning. It is certification. Oh, well, I'm glad I figured that out, because that'd been a terrible thing to miss out on. So that's kind of an image, kind of picture of what happened at UVA.
Well, I appreciate that kind of, and that makes, the soup that makes a person, these things, it's because I've dropped into, a lot of videos and conversations that you've been a part of or that you've hosted. And I'm kind of like, well, I'm picking up, like I said, these pieces. I'm like, but who is this guy? Like, what's the, and I'd rather do that in a conversation, like, get the makeup. And it's funny. I went to college. I felt, this call to ministry, I was very Reformed Baptist, and I wasn't going there for the degree. I was going there to try to find people to be in a band with me. That nice. Is like, I didn't really, I wouldn't have said that consciously. I may be on the verge of could have say that consciously, but I felt like if I said that, I would be saying something that was, kind of crass or something. Like, oh no, I need to be going here to get a music degree or a theology degree, which I got a minor in music and an undergrad in theology. But it was like, ultimately, I was trying to get that modern group and find the people. I'd seen other people do that in this college, and that was what really drew me to that place was that thing. And so what happened outside of the classroom, leading worship at chapels and at the midweek services, like at BCM and those types of things, like that for me was actually the greater education. And that actually, now they have certified degrees for modern worship stuff at a lot of schools that didn't exist in, 2005. I was kind of making that up as I went, because I could see that like as a telos, but there wasn't an exact certification process for that, you could say. So that's interesting. And so another piece of conversation, I guess, what's been very alive for me in our present time, and also is related to what I came into this space kind of looking for. I was listening to that conversation with you and Cadell related to his book, Real Speculations, was kind of two parts. the subconscious or the unconscious forces that are driving us, that we want to say that it's the belief or the proposition many times it's underneath us. It's what's driving us. And then also how that gets formed and shaped and how that comes through. That's been a journey for me in this space of trying to understand an experience that I had that was, mystical in nature, and that I believe came from that place. And so that again was this other question about what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to have these experiences that are pretty universal in a certain way? And, characters like Peterson, characters like Peugeot help do that. But in this conversation that that y'all were having, specifically talking about those forces, and also talking about them, like what we're seeing in real time related to Charlie Kirk, Nick Fuentes, the right, like, I feel like that's Trump, as you mentioned, now almost a decade ago. These are subconscious forces that are driving a lot. And there was a point in there that y'all talked about, if the subconscious becomes conscious, that's when it gets very dangerous. And I was wanting you to kind of parse some of that.
Oh, that's a big one. That's very important and very, defines our moment a lot. Yeah, it definitely going to school and going into spaces, having a sense of what's important is a really great gift, because you can miss finding that band, you can miss finding those people, and then they're not there, right, in your life. So I think it's just really, it's quite a gift to have that kind of intuition or that sense. So, and I was blessed to kind of grow up with people that gave me that. Certainly also, I was, very good friends with a man named Bernard Hankins, who I think is, the greatest spoken word poet I've ever heard. Him, it's just extraordinary. And we talked a whole lot about like cypher, hip hop, sort of this way of thinking that's improvisation based versus the verification, the certification, and thinking kind of that gap between those different. That was a big impact on me as well. And I think also what's very interesting is if you're not trained in that way of thinking that's more improvisational, the ability to go into a conversation and not know what you're going to say, but also not be nervous the entire time. These are all actually practices that help you deal with the subconscious when it shows up, that if you don't have and you're not ready for, it can destroy you because it overwhelms you and you're destroyed, right? So we've actually not generally in culture had the institutions to think and to hold ourselves in a world where we're prepared for the unexpected. Actually, the mature person plans away the unexpected. And this has set us up to be unprepared for Fuentes and Nick and Trump and all these people, because they represent basically subconscious forces, ultimately, that are not addressed. The libidinal, the theopolitical, the thing we didn't want to look at, et cetera, so forth. You mentioned before also bypassing. Basically, we've done that on the political. The socio-political is full of bypassing, and that doesn't work. You pay a price, baby. It eventually comes back around. So a way I think about to kind of look at the tension of the moment, the main thinker of belonging, again, is a man named Philip Reef. He wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic that I'm very fortunate that Vincent Zemin said, you should read this book. So Vincent, thank you, because I wouldn't have read it without you, baby. And basically, to put a very good, to simplify the argument, is Philip Reef says that human beings require givens and releases. They require things they don't have to question. But then if they question nothing, they're slaves and they're oppressed. So they need releases. Now, what he was concerned about in the 60s and 70s was this: basically anything that was a constraint, as he called it, or a given, as I call it, was seen as oppressive and bad. Like if you were told, you need to, you need to go to church because it's good for you. And you would say, well, I don't want to, therefore. And you would say, well, therefore it is bad. I should be released from that. And there was, deconstruction, right? That any givens, gender, any of that people talk about now, those would be constraints. And the assumption was the triumph of the therapeutic, which is basically getting rid of all repression, pure release, would be freedom. That freedom was found from the removal of all repression, right? Well, actually what ends up happening that Philip Reef talks about is that when you introduce the human subject to no constraint whatsoever, they go crazy. It turns out that freedom destroys us. We can't handle freedom, actually. We don't like freedom. It overwhelms us. Because if I say to you, Christian, you can do X and Y, what do you want to do? Well, you actually can get very nervous because what does choosing X say about me? And what is Daniel going to think if I do X instead of Y? And I don't even know why I want to do X instead of Y. I'll put it off till tomorrow. I'll do it tomorrow, right? We don't actually like freedom very much because we don't like being seen in light of what we do with our freedom. And also, if your neighbor, parents know about this real well, if your neighbor raises their children different than you raise your children, or they have a different view of screen time or discipline or eating or whatever, then you question yourself. You're like, well, how do I know that I'm doing it right? What if I'm doing it wrong? What if I'm setting my child up for failure? Right? Like, that's one of the great tensions of modern society is it's no longer given that your neighbor is going to generally be similar from you. Well, what other people choose impact what your choices mean to you. The libertarian mistake is basically what all the sociologists were warning, is that individuals in isolation making free choices do impact the choices of their neighbor because it impacts how they psychologically relate to their own choices. They become more uncertain about them. They become more anxious. And when people are anxious, they tend to blow up. They tend to be miserable. They tend to get bored. The main thing that people do is isolate. The way you deal with the feeling of questioning your own choices in light of the neighbor who chooses differently is not to hang out with your neighbor. And that's where people like, I think Bowling Alone, Putman, a lot of his ideas on the loss of social capital, I think that's all very good. It's very true that we no longer invest in social capital. But why don't we invest in social capital? Because we actually don't like running into people who are different from us that make us question everything. It lost priority, right? Because of the anxiety. And this is why, too, the temptation to restore community is tied to ideological purity, the removal of the other, because you're trying to recreate psychological stability. And unfortunately, the reason why we wrote Belonging Again is because, people are going to get their belonging. The question is, are they going to get it in a way that isolates and removes diversity, or are we going to find belonging in a new way that doesn't? So, because Nick and all of the post-liberal forces, as I would call them, are basically efforts to restore belonging, to regain belonging. Unfortunately, this belonging is recreating the conditions of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, the unquestioning closed-mindedness, where you just do what we do and you don't question it. And when you don't question things, you can become a force of evil and not even know it. So here's the other issue. So if you get rid of givens and you release everyone, they tend to be overwhelmed by their anxiety and either they tend to, in that condition, turn to a strong man, okay? Like they go to a strong man to restore stability, or they isolate. There's a growing trend of global hikimorism, like in Japan, where people don't leave their apartment. That's growing, and that's only incels. All of that is just often a recapitulation of that. The way you deal with the anxiety of otherness is isolation, hikimorism, which technology increasingly allows you to do. And if the other makes you anxious, isn't it rational to avoid them? Wouldn't that be the smart thing to do? Oh, dang, I guess we need to tie rationality to a moral vision. Well, we don't believe in moral visions because we don't have first principles. Well, then it's rational to isolate. Like hell's rational. That's the problem. Like it's really rational to lock yourself from the inside because you have to deal with those people that make you anxious. So you get rid of givens, you release people, and they isolate people. We think that if you release people, they go off into the wild and explore diversity. Nah, they isolate. And if they do travel, they treat the places they go like a barbarian, getting their experiences, but not honoring the roots of wherever they visit. Like modern terrorism is kind of, there's one Italian philosopher who says it's like a modern barbaricism where we just visit places, take our experiences, get our fun and leave. And they're just, they serve us versus us honor them. And that's a problem. So release is bad. But here's the other issue though. Pure givenness, where you don't question anything, you just do what you're born into. You're a Christian, you're in a Christian state, you don't question anything. Well, pure givenness is then, it's given that blacks are inferior to whites. It's given that women are inferior to, and you don't think about it, right? So you get the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt describes. Very important. This does not mean the boredom of evil. It means the everydayness of evil. Like, see, her whole idea is that the Nazis, they were like, we're just doing what one does, dang it. This is just what one does. Whites are superior to blacks. Nazis are superior to everyone else. So it becomes banal in the sense of it's not a moral choice. It's just the roboticism. It's just the everydayness. Please.
And that goes back to, I watched Jordan Peterson speak live. I mean, that was the seed of his question for maps of meaning was kind of the problem was this very question of how does evil become banal? I mean, that really was the seed of his search. And so how is it that it becomes given that this is how society is and all these things? And
Absolutely.
so
well,
go ahead.
Not to jump on. I'm sorry.
No,
Jordan
keep
Peterson.
going.
So Philip Reef he's thinking Freud, and he's arriving at these conclusions. Jordan Peterson is thinking Jung and arriving at these conclusions, because chaos and order, these very much map onto givens and releases, right? It's just that Philip Reef is a great Freud scholar, and he's really interested in the civilization and its discontents. But it is not by chance that Jordan Peterson, interested in this problem, which I think is basically the problem that Philip Reef is pointing to, then rose to popularity because he was able to articulate the tragedy. And tragedy, as Martha Nussbaum points out, is not a catastrophe. A tragedy is a trade-off of competing goods. Givens are good and releases are good. Choose the proportionality. So here's the other problem. 60-40, 50-50, 30-20, what's the percentage breakdown, right? And what circumstance is the breakdown? So maybe I need 80% givens and 20% releases, but another personality type, high in openness or whatever, maybe that's 30-70, right? There's some kind of trade-off between those things, and all of them become different risks. Well, how you make those trade-offs is going to be tied to your education to live discern, your moral vision of reality, your first principles. And basically what we did, you could say this again is the mistake of Francis Fukuyama in the End of History, is basically like, no, you don't need to make those trade-offs because the market is rational. Like, people in their self-interest are rational, and we will naturally proportion the most efficient breakdown between givens and releases in circumstances via market forces and collective consciousness and intelligence. Right?
And this is all breaking down in real time. Even something like the merger of Warner Brothers and Netflix feels like people are recognizing like, oh, this is a capitalist force that, in a certain way we would have said we agree with, but it's like, why am I uncomfortable with this happening in front of my eyes? Because it represents, Hollywood is watching the theater, an abstraction of the play, you could say, become even more abstracted and more isolating. Everyone knows that this is a problem, but it's like it can't stop because this is what it's the rational telos of the market, and so for the investors or the board, so that's the rational. So it is it points back to a first principle of something like depravity, or something like a human condition that has a broken nature related to it, left to and that's also a part about I don't know if this is exactly the use of the word the givenness, but the relationship towards the ends of history, again, not knowing what that's standing on. Like, oh, we can just like teach history now, not knowing that these I can't remember the moral formation or what the moral vision, not knowing or taking it obviously for granted, or saying that this is obviously the breakdown in the new atheism, that it can exist without it, that we're rational. Sam Harris, we're rational. We can be moral without morality or something like that. Absolutely. And so we are watching this in real time, and it's hard in certain ways, like, having young children thinking about this world that's kind of developing at the same time. But and even the other parts of the conversation you're talking about, well, where do we go? Are we becoming more isolated? And so I jump into this digital space to try to find someone to actually wrestle with these ideas with. And I, in my own life, in this project, that's, something along the lines of like, why has Peugeot had that refrain for a very long time, which was to go to church, like what you can do something to force yourself into uncomfortable community. Because as much as ideological purity people want to pretend can be found in any in a certain ecclesiological body, you are always going to find difference in other. And it's actually important that we remember how to exist, worship, sing, eat with the other.
Absolutely. Well, to me, that also gets into where Cadell emphasizes the crack, the lack, the anxiety. Mm-hmm. You see, the issue is that if you simply disembody, or you don't encounter the other person, and you associate feeling good with making the right decision, then you'll say, I made the right decision. But if you understand that, no, actually the right decision is on the other side of not liking things, then it's like, well, then maybe I should go to church, and maybe I should talk to those people I don't want to talk to. So, but here's the point. What's the rational way to interpret your emotions? Is it rational to interpret your emotions as meaning you shouldn't interact with that person? Or is it rational to interpret your emotion of anxiety as meaning you should interpret with those people, right? What's the rational way to respond to a feeling of disgust or anger or stuff like that, right? Ivan Illich says that the man on the side of the road was disgusting, and the Good Samaritan helped them all the same. So what's the rational way to respond to disgust? Is disgust evidence of needing to get over yourself and interact with a person? Or is disgust evidence that you shouldn't interact with them? Well, here's the problem. Your interpretation of that emotion cannot be quantified by market forces, and in fact is completely contingent upon your moral vision of reality, your religion, and your first principles.
So that just kind of falls back, and this was where Cadell and I both came to in the previous conversation, but it was like something along the lines of this voluntary self-sacrifice, which is, emblematic of something related to the gospel. So it's this, that message and that idea, and that was where, Peterson came to, and it doesn't maybe answer all questions of, not knowing maybe as a person why maybe certain suffering might be existing upon you. Sometimes that's like a Job is a little bit more related to faith or something like that. But in another sense of dealing with, like, it is counterintuitive, because that sounds like a little bit of what you're talking about with, like, well, if I'm anxious, my intuition tells me danger, Will Robinson, danger, don't go be around difference or something like that. And so that is, there is an kind of an evolutionary something or another, which of impulse to protect yourself or something like that. These tribal forces, because again, even our identities and what's happening with our algorithm, siloed algorithmic, realities is, we have these digital tribes, that we, even this is emblematic of that in a certain way. And then, but it has reinforced for me, the necessity again for that reality just doesn't, you can curate digitally in such a way. I mean, it teaches us this, but it's not for the sake of it shouldn't be, maybe, unless you're a transhumanist, for the sake of isolation. It has to, I believe it needs to inform and encourage, grass touching, bumping into people and such.
Well, to say something large that I'd have to justify is basically there has not been. So one of the reasons we're in the situation we are in now is because you had the pricing mechanism, pricing coordination of Friedrich Hayek that very effectively coordinated resources around the world. But we haven't had a social coordination mechanism that could work as efficiently and quickly as pricing. And therefore, the habits of pricing has eclipsed social formation. And that's why we have all the trouble. But this online combination of YouTube, Zoom, recorded conversation is what I call and I see as a social coordination mechanism, which has been missing in history to dialectically work with the pricing mechanism so that we're not overdetermined by market forces and can work with them. So this technology, in my opinion, is actually what has kind of always been needed to actually deal with the overextensions of capitalism that has proven auto-cannibalistic by giving us an opportunity to humanize ourselves more efficiently across diversity in a manner that deals with I got to pick up the kids and do the dishes, but I can, because also when I first talked to you, another major problem of why it's been so difficult to socially form in a manner that was able to avoid overdetermination by pricing is because of something that I would call the introduction problem. And what that is like, I feel like I already know you, right? We're talking for the first time, but I've seen videos. I have a sense of how you think. So you overcome the introduction problem. And I would argue the introduction problem greatly slows down relationship, hearing new ideas, formation. But I'm actually able to come into a conversation with people I've never met before and kind of already have a starting position, right? And that helps me kind of know what would be relevant to talk about, what's not relevant to talk about, what the person is interested in. The introduction problem which I would actually argue most universities, they're mostly in the business of helping people overcome the introduction problem. You've never heard of English? We now have the technology to overcome the introduction problem, which has been actually one of the main reasons we haven't been able to deal with pluralism and diversity well, because how do you become effectively introduced to a wide, diverse amount of people, not everyone, but enough to get a kind of sense of it, without meeting them or hearing them talk? And what were the chances you were going to meet and talk with people in Rexburg, Virginia, of sufficient diversity to expand you at a rate that you could handle, but not so much that you couldn't handle, right? Because the other thing with recorded conversations is you can listen to 20 minutes, say, I don't know, let me think about that, come back, kind of do it in your own time, and self-develop in a way that can kind of gradually warm you up to the difference and the new ideas, so that when you actually meet the person, you're not overwhelmed by the difference. So you see, the social coordination mechanism also helps people gradually introduce to new ideas, like gradually encounter otherness, then take some time, processes, and come back. But if you're just thrown into a conversation with radical atheists, crazy, someone who's really different, you don't know where to start. You don't even know how they think because of the introduction problem. You don't know how to properly introduce yourself to this difference to make the interaction constructive. So then it probably doesn't go well, which then you interpret as evidence that you shouldn't interact with those kinds of people because they're idiots, and you go back to your tribe, and we have all sorts of problems, right? Also, too, without the social coordination mechanism, I would argue we haven't been able to, well, really have realistically lifelong learning or real education, because real education comes from conversations. And here's another thing, critically, overhearing conversations. One of the number one ways people learn is not the lecture, where someone looks at me and lectures at me. It's when I sit in the diner and listen to Mr. Chapman and Mr. Dillard, and I just overhear them. That is one of the most powerful ways for people to learn. And we've not had
Sorry, we paused for a second. You said we've not had what?
We've not had infrastructures to give the average person access to overhearing conversations they need to overhear. Because that's a way you can get ideas into your own head to process them without feeling judgmental, without feeling like I don't know what to say and what do I do, right? Overhearing conversation is also where you can like learn about Freud and Lacan. Say, I don't know what I think about these people, but let me overhear these people. That kind of warms you up, kind of gives you a sense of it. The same with orthodoxy. The overheard conversation is one of the most powerful ways human beings learn. And we've not effectively had a technology or a coordination mechanism to enable that. And I would argue that kind of education is what you need to properly defend yourself against the habits that are formed by the liturgy of capital markets that are going to subconsciously train you into quantification from quality thinking, verification from personal knowledge, and all of those other things that once you are habituated that way, you're going to be unable to participate in the market in a manner that doesn't dehumanize you. And I would actually argue be good for the markets, because the markets tend to thrive when people are more human being, personal knowledge, they're more creative, et cetera, so forth. So the online, so for me, a lot of what this little corner people call liminal web, Goodell, para-academic, all of this to me is modeling a way to use the technology that's not anti-technology, but it to enable personhood. So that then when you go to church, you're more able to handle it and to form it. And maybe people could then handle not bypassing and actually dealing with sin on a real life. Like one of the issues is people aren't ready for it, please.
Which is like a little bit of why Vander Clay's estuary model is really creates a analog space for that as well.
Absolutely.
And the other thing that was coming up was just the related to using these technologies to do that is the thread that I was going to take is like, so we had basically we're in a new phase. We had 10 years of the ingestment of podcasting basically for 10 years. And now we're hitting a point where like now everybody is quote unquote podcasting, doing philosophy, doing conversation. Like, so now we've crossed over, people are like, oh, our numbers aren't as good on YouTube. There, and what that is the market is doing something a little bit like what you're talking about, because it's more interesting. There's a little bit of a decadence related to celebrity podcasting, that someone was telling a story one time about watching, I don't know if it's Shapiro and Peterson have dinner in Greece or somewhere, Israel, and talking about Western civilization. And it was this decadent thing. And it's like, I'm here behind the glass, like looking at you feasting. And the technology is allowing us to, in the words of somebody like Grim Gribb, break the fourth wall, break through that glass, and begin to partake in that meal for that good communion for ourselves. And so it's a very powerful time that we're entering into, that I feel like some of these, like you said, the corner and these other liminal webs and stuff, like, are seeing that, are participating in that. And it is a good, and it is a kind of like another meme related to this is like a plundering of Egypt to a degree related to such things.
No, I think it's like, for me, there's a way in which it is very important to see. So it's all about order, right? I think, Augustine or C.S. Lewis, he has that idea that if you put first things first, you get second things also. But if you put second things first, you lose both. This is one of the most important, in my opinion, one of the most valuable mental models out there, because social coordination, which I would argue is what we're doing, creates a podcast, because that is just the residue. That is just what kind of comes out of it, so that other people can overhear the conversation. But the podcasting is secondary to the social coordination that enables relationship. If you make your goal the podcasting, then the podcasting ain't even any good, and you don't even get social coordination. But if you make social coordination your main goal, you also get podcasting, and they also maintain humanity. The reason why there's a big difference between creating content, because your goal is the content, versus content being created by your encounters, because that is necessary to overcome the introduction problem, so that people can hear the ideas at the rate. Also, the ability to re-listen to a conversation you had with a human being, that's insanely powerful. Like, I can re-listen to this talk and hear and like, you internalize it, you think about it differently. That's a very different thing. Also, as people meet in this online space, one of the main things that has hurt us, I'll say the average person, is the inability to travel. For most of human history, travel was basically business travel or people with money, right? If you were going to travel, you had to get a hotel. You really didn't know what you were going to do, so you just did tourist traps. But then the problem with tourism is you don't encounter the real difference. Well, hey, you have reason. Like, if you come to Virginia, there's a person there's someone in Arkansas, right? Like, it really enables traveling. It's really hard to handle pluralism if you don't travel, right? But then it's really hard to know where to travel, how to travel, and not to break the bank. And like, you're just going to visit Virginia if you don't know anyone. Where are you going to go? What are you going to do, right? So people don't travel. And then what happens is travel, which is encountering other cultures and differences, tend to get captured primarily by the business class and the white collar people. So all of them are like, dude, liberalism's great. Neoliberalism is fantastic. Diversity, accept diversity, just be open to the other. And then the working class people are like, yeah, you're basically guilting me for my gender, sex, race, and all of that, right? Because they don't ever get to experience diversity as beautiful, because they usually don't get to travel very much or even know where to begin. Right? Well, this also, the social coordination mechanism opens up the plausibility for average people to travel and to see new places and to encounter new people. Because if I just visit like Arkansas, for example, well, I don't even know how to get started. But if I visit you in Arkansas, you can take me to your church and you can take me to the community. You see what I'm saying? And that's a very, very different and a very much more embodied experience of Arkansas. So it goes with Europe. So it goes with China, et cetera, so forth. So and also too, basically, without traveling as such, it becomes much more likely that people's thinking and habits are just captured by the market and fungibility and the quantification, because we're not realistically able to experience different qualities of life. Because to experience different qualities of life, I need to get embedded with a person who lives there. And how do I even do that? Right?
Yeah, there's kind of making the map. Oh, I've been to all 50 states, or I've looked at I've touched them.
Quantification.
Yeah. So, and then versus there's this really recent example of this. Have you ever come across Jared, the atheist church auditor channel? Or this?
No, I have not. Oh yeah.
I've had him on the channel. He's been an atheist for a while, and he goes to all these different churches and kind of sects and cults, and he does an audit of them afterwards. And he's met some relatively famous Christian influencers through this and all these other things. He's getting a lot of positive feedback, but he's, his trope is atheism, of course, so he can be quote unquote objective about his experiences. So, but he recently went to spent 2 weeks in Egypt with a couple, a deacon from a Coptic church, and this conversation, like as he outlined it, started early this year, February or so. He gets an email, people watching his channel. Hey, I think you would be really great if you went to church with us in Egypt when we take this trip from Australia. This was a deacon in the Coptic church from Australia. So, and he's like, we'll pay for it, and we just want you to come be a part of it. You can document it. And someone else gave him a new camera lens to take on the trip. And he's getting up at 3 a.m. on for 2 weeks and going to liturgy from 3 to 5 or 8 o'clock or something like that. And then they're going and traveling 2 hours across the desert to this monastery and to this holy site. And he's with this couple that are familiar, know the language, know he didn't just go, he was embedded, and that happened through this very medium that you're talking about in a way. And again, is there a Christian charity? Is there a Christian desire for maybe him to know God through like a type of witness and evangelism, even a Coptic evangelism of sorts? Of course, there is a desire for that, but it wasn't really presented that way. It's just like, hey, we like what you're doing. We want to host you. We think this would be important. That maybe they felt called or had a vision or something, but regardless, it happened. And it was to this very point. He doesn't do a podcast per se, but he's got emails open and he's got commenters and conversations that take place. And he does go into places and have conversations with the pastors of so-and-so church. So it's very much like you said, it is changing how that happens. And I could give examples from this corner of the internet, and they're conferencing and having a value for camp outs as a result of coming into these places is another part of that. And so it is a fascinating time related to that whole conversation of the medium is the message, McLuhan's, that type of thing. And the part about participating, taking in, obviously this was implied, but when you were talking about overhearing the conversation, we have been in this state of maybe chronic overhearing. At some point, the mature move is to begin having the conversations. And so that is then this liturgy of coming out of the lurk and coming up, and participating because you've been listening for 4 years, but now you feel like maybe I have something of value to add to the conversation. Very powerful.
Well, very important, because there's something now. So there's something also about overhearing that has a natural tendency to, I can talk with those person because I know what they think. I have a sense of who they are, because most people are like, I don't know where to begin. The I don't know where to begin problem, right? Overhearing can help with that. Also, overhearing can be part of the lack, there's a problem of a lack of models, a lack of apprenticeship, a lack of kind of direction, rituals. There's all of that, right? Overhearing can be a kind of apprenticeship, a kind of like role of how to get up to speed on different things. Also very, very, very important. I know in these kind of speeches, it can seem like guys or girls or whoever are just kind of exchanging ideas. It should never be forgotten that what you're showing on these conversations online is not merely an exchange of ideas, but a quality of relating with another human being. Because you're talking, most people, this is a crazy claim. I'm not sure if most people on earth have ever had a conversation. I know that's a nutsy claim. Most people, when they talk with people, it's a trivia show, as Neil Postman said. What did you do today? Give me the right answer. You ask me, it's an exchange of trivia, right? But it's not a conversation, like a co-making, a co-working together. Like, look how many of these podcasts are 5 or 6 hours, 2 hours or whatever. How is that possible? Because you forget yourself. Because you have a conversation where you literally, in the quality of the interaction, gain what Lewis called self-forgetful. Well, Keller would talk about self-forgetfulness, this kind of flow. Like most people on earth have never had that experience. And I would also argue as a side note that that experience is very necessary for habituating you in a manner where you're not overdetermined by the logic of markets, capital, and thus all the problems that come with that. Like once you have this experience, then it actually makes you say, I like that experience. And I actually, I see what conversations are for. Most people are terrified of conversations because they have to. So your mom's like, so what are you doing? How's work? How's the family? And you're like, oh my gosh, I'm failing. Most people hate talking with people because all that happens in conversation is a reminder that they failed. They don't like that. So then they avoid conversation, right? So when you do these conversations, you're showing it is possible to, in a conversation, forget about time. Most people in conversation are looking at the clock and go, well, I'll talk 5 minutes. I can leave now and it not be rude because it was 5 minutes. I had enough exchange to not be a bad person. But it's not a genuine, it is possible for people to hunger for relation. It is possible for people to hunger for conversation. And here's the problem. People do hunger for relation. But then when they meet people, if all they ever find is trouble or judgment or trivia or conversations that suck, well, then people are like, I tricked myself. I tricked myself. I wanted relation and relations are terrible. So I'm just going to try to learn how to drug myself as a hikikomori. I'm going to learn how to get rid of that feeling. I'm going to learn how to cover it with rage. I'm going to look for a political party that disavows marriage and love and sex and children, all that. I'm going to look for someone to tell me that feeling I had inside of me was a trick, not some sort of spirit that's actually showing me the truth of reality. Because that's the only thing that seems rational to do if most conversations and relationships you have with people are terrible. But when you actually have the experience of the ability to, in a conversation, lose track of time, and it turns out that the point of philosophy is that it enables that kind of conversation. It's not about the proposition, because philosophy always can create wonder. It can always create the unfolding. So philosophy is to serve the possibility of that kind of relating with the other person, not because you have all of the ideas of how the world works. No, it's so that you can make something work between you and the other person and have a certain quality of experience, right? So what you're doing in these online spaces is you're showing the possibility of that way of relating with another person. You're modeling something. You're not merely giving people ideas to people. You're not merely, I kick these out. You're not merely like telling people like how to think about Aquinas or Austin Farrow, whatever. It just turns out that talking about Aquinas and Austin Farrow is part of the flow. It is part of actually what makes people relate in discussion with one another. You know, Austin Farrow, it actually makes me think of this wonderful, and I think forgetting this is killed. I don't even see them. Anyway, Austin Farrow basically said the following. He's like, Aquinas did not write the Summa Theologica because he thought a bunch of people were going to get PhDs on it and study it, et cetera, so forth. He's like, he wrote the Theologica because he was taken up by a vision of something that he climbed the ladder and he forgot himself, right? He was taken by something, right? So, you know, the genius is in the fingertips. It knows not what it does, I believe Mr. Farrow put it, right? So likewise, what you're doing is all of this is in service of a certain mode of getting caught up in something that can come alive between people that people don't believe in. They don't believe in. So why should they bother with church? Why should they bother with community? Why should they bother to reconcile with their brother or neighbor? Why should they bother with these things? All that happens is trivia questions and reminders that I don't make as much money as Bob does. Why would I bother? Why would I not watch Netflix all the time? Why would I not seek a dopamine drug? What vision of interacting with other people do you offer that would show that that's not a good idea? Well, we're offering it here. That's what you're modeling and to show people. And that matters because most people have never had that experience. So I just think it's very important to see this work online as also modeling that type of relationality in a world of a friend session. People don't have friends, right? Lost connections. Most people don't have friends. They don't have community. And they don't know how to have conversation. Well, it can be done. It can be modeled. It can be shown. But you see, and I'll throw it back at you. But unfortunately, we have used education not to enable people to have this kind of conversation with one another, to humanize one another, but to get them a job, to get them certified. So we've mostly focused on learning for certification, which of course can have a role. Faced with AI, I think that has to shift. But that's terrifying to you unless you realize, well, what if actually AI just kind of unveiled this kind of learning? this like education and service of this quality of relationality, right? Then it can be a force and function for the good, but we also have to have the courage to face it. I'll pause with that.
That is, that is the another existential question that we're facing related to what to do if in the what seems possibly the inevitability of some kind of replacement, vocational replacement, bringing up other questions about things we thought were given about the market, as you're talking about, and then the whole modeling of conversation. It's funny because when I was coming up with kind of the ideas for this podcast, and it's not really like I don't have yours truly really written anywhere.
Yep.
And it hardly, and I don't, and Conversation Craft isn't the name of the podcast, but it was so interesting because I hadn't really thought about it. And then I started looking around. It's one of those things when you're going to buy a white car, and then all of a sudden you're looking around and all the cars are white type thing. But, Minecraft, Voicecraft, Kingdom Craft. I started seeing these things. But before that, where I got it from was actually the production company called Rankin and Bass. I don't know if you are familiar with the video production company. They made the first Hobbit cartoon. They actually made the cartoon, the Thundercats. They made the Last Unicorn.
Yes.
They actually were the Frosty and the Snowman. They made those stop motion animation of like Rudolph the Red. So, and their production company originally was called Videocraft. And that captured me. I was like, oh, and then they got bought by Disney in the late 80s, and it just, as things do, as we're seeing even more, just that idea in a sense. There was still a lot going on in the 90s with of live creativity in Disney. But I was like, oh, well, conversation, that's kind of what podcasting is. It's like a craft, it was kind of this. And I looked at their, they were very creative, and I had struggled feeling creative, covering worship songs for 15 years. You don't feel creative when you're covering, like if you're presenting as a creative band, but you're not writing any of this stuff. And I just had this kind of, and so when I got into this space, that was like, oh, this is a craft. That's what this is, and so I just kind of went with it. But I didn't see the other stuff until later. That has really been caught up related to it took a lot of the pressure off of that. This has to be perfect as well. This has to already be something because it's a craft. It's seeing these things as and I had actually known that. I'd worked with bands, I'd worked with ensembles, and I saw, it takes 5 years for a group to really, like, I saw some like timetables of development, these things happen. And so again, taking the pressure off it, and this other piece of kind of playing with, am I trying to do a podcast, or am I seeking genuine conversation and curiosity? And what is it, a little bit of both? And is the market kind of driving this? And how much does the market play in which, when you're trying to find the conversation that you actually want to have versus, well, if I have that conversation and it makes my channel do this, then maybe I can have this conversation, or it would apparently legitimize you for having another conversation. And those are all alive, to come to say that you're not paying attention to them, how to our relationship to these things. And I think, again, I'll go back to Paul Vanderklay being a good, model, or a good role model. And something you were saying earlier about not even knowing that we're like desire these kind of conversations. I remember being a freshman in college, and you're constantly being told as a young Baptist or evangelical, you're being like, you need to find somebody to disciple you. You need to find somebody to disciple you. But no one does it. No one is. And I remember I walked up to our assistant campus minister my freshman year, who I thought was cool and, charismatic. And I just was like, Spencer, will you disciple me? And he's like, all right, I'll really take that consideration. He moves the next semester. I walked up to another guy that I thought was deep. He was in Reformed theology. He was a guitar player in this band. I was like, Tommy, will you disciple me? And he met with me a couple of times. But I had this, what I'm trying to say is I had that hunger. Like, I want a conversation. I want a relationship. And again, it wasn't like, teach me how to be moral in a sense. Like, I think that was secondary to what I was really desiring. And, you know, then when I went back to college to start a new career, to get a new certification, you know, to enter back into the capital market, because you have to in a certain way, in some way. I found a guy who was watching Peterson and he watching this stuff, and we sat down and had a 6-hour conversation. And I was like, how does that happen? Like,
Exactly.
you know,
Yep.
And that began to, and that was again almost now a decade ago, but it was like, oh, these things are real, and there's a hunger, and it's still like, you know, the meaning crisis. That's a big part of it. And is everybody, are there limitations of certain kinds of intellect that maybe there isn't a certain kind of necessity or hunger or a curiosity for verbal conversation, but probably maybe musical conversation, artistic conversation? You know, there's other modes in which people are having deep conversation and deep philosophical resonance, you know, that aren't maybe verbal in a certain way. And, you know, I think that, but again, some of this medium is allowing for people to find that. And like dealing with, I heard you talk about dealing with the global are we pluralistic? Oh, yes, we are. Are we global in many, many ways? And now with AI translation being built into, like, this stuff's going to continue to nick land, techno acceleration, this kind of singularity, it seems, that we're kind of driving towards, related to artificial general intelligence, but also something related to the Tower of Babel, in this, like, you know, of communication barriers continuing to be diminished. It's all at play, and it's all curious, and it's all intense, but it's also exciting, or in a certain way. And I don't know, those are just a lot of pieces that are flowing back to me.
No, very, very important. People, so basically the hunger for discipleship is for those kind of 6-hour lose yourself in relationships. So there's a few things. I've never met anyone that can't talk for a very long time on something. Maybe it's football, maybe it's gardening, maybe it's something. Most people say they're not a conversationalist, but if you talk about like the high school football game, they'll talk all night, right?
Yeah.
They'll go on and on,
Yeah.
right? Many people like who call themselves introverts, they actually will talk quite a lot if you get on what they don't consider a frivolous topic, right? So first off, I think I agree with you that it doesn't necessarily have to be verbal, but I would also say that a lot of people are actually more verbal than they realize, because they've never had a real conversation or met the conditions of possibility for it, right? And I also would say too, like, everyone wants to lose themselves in something, right? Worship, love, the things that people value the most. This is a giant claim. The things that people would say are the most important things in their life are all things that you can lose yourself in. Like that, where the passage of time change, your relation to time changes. And of course, part of the
Chronos.
secret, that's it. Yeah, right. Leisure, festival, Piper, like a key, I would argue practical, like a key practical guide for if what you are doing is in the spirit, aligned with what it means for new creation, it will be a change in your relation to time. You will experience time differently. I would argue, now this would get into Bergson and different things, like if you're stuck in clock time, this is bad. You're supposed to be in this creative fullness of time, right? That is eternity. That is latent in time, but it gets divided up. But more has to be said on this. So also too, just a few more things, and then this discipleship point is very important because it actually ties to the apologetic stuff, is that also this technology of the social coordination mechanism, it allows also the possibility of people seeing the Christian life without it being so direct that it feels oppressive, right? Like, because it's very important, like the problem with there's always a problem in Christianity with evangelicism, right? Like telling people about the good word, right? Which ultimately, just because of efficiency as God, becomes a tract, quantifiable, very quick Roman road, et cetera, so forth, right? But in a certain sense, you can't blame people though, right? Because there's like, well, what else do we do, right? We have to spread the word in the message, and nuance tends to, and the idea is, well, we'll simplify it, and then when they get into the church, we'll unpack it, right? But we got to get them in, right? But problematically, you develop habits as you do the simplified version, and by the time people come in, you've actually gotten out of the habit of being able to unpack it, and that's the sociological revelation, right? So you can't, it's not so simple, even if it's understandable, right? What you also have on these online conversations is the ability to shine with gospel life, shine with kind of the way it is to live the gospel, where people can experience it indirectly and then be attracted to it on their own in their own wrestling, right? And that's really important because it becomes a kind of evangelicism via shining, which to me also is why beauty is evangelical, because beauty attracts, right? It doesn't, like, truth is very top down, but beauty attracts, it shines. So likewise, in doing this kind of work online, it can be a certain sort of, people see it and they're attracted to it and they're moved in and they can overhear, and it's like, oh, I didn't know about that with, say, the church and Christianity, right? So that's also really important, because there's been a major problem in Christianity on the problem of evangelicism and how to do it in a manner that is not top down, over the top, forcive,
sentimental, coercive.
Yes, exactly. And ultimately, it becomes market-based. It becomes market.
Yes.
It's like selling a product, right? Now, of course, the great Malcolm Muggeridge wrote this lovely book talking about a global television network as the fourth temptation of Christ in the wilderness, because you can just use TV to tell everyone about the gospel. And I think Muggeridge was saying something very important, but this is different. This is not content creation. This is relation coordination, right? And this is actually in service of kingdom making, not simply using a telecommunication powerhouse by which to spread a message without character personal development, right? So I take Malcolm Muggeridge quite seriously, but I think there are differences that are very, very important. Now, on discipleship. So basically, I'm of the opinion that elders, disciples, people like this, we don't know what they're for. We're confused about them. And one of the reasons is because of all of the lurking epistemological mistakes that have been pointed to. So I'll say a few things.
This kind of leads into the Ross Bird conversation. I think that
absolutely
that would be a good place to kind of round things out with today.
Absolutely. So discipleship or eldership. So, the book we wrote, that's book 2 of The Truism of the Rational, is called The Map is Indestructible. And it's the idea that the map is not the territory, and that basically a map is not merely a notion. It is a world, let's put it this way. It's a worldview that entails no essential contradiction, meaning it could be true. It may not be, but you can't say that it's necessarily false because it has no essential contradiction, okay? I would make the argument that things like Christianity, communism, Islam, etc., so forth, these are what I call internally consistent systems, meaning that they entail no essential contradiction. They may not correspond with reality, but there is nothing within the worldview that would unveil them to necessarily be false. Okay, well, that's very interesting. One, it creates a lot of challenges for pluralism because it shows that reasoning is not enough, because reasoning can't deconstruct that. It's internally consistent. It's internally consistent if you accept the first principles. If you accept that God exists, and if you accept Jesus rose from the grave, I would argue there's nothing in Christian theology that cannot necessarily follow. It may not follow, but there is no what's called an essential contradiction. Here's another giant claim. The dream of the Enlightenment is that there was only one internally consistent system. So if we deconstructed everything, we'd be left with the truth, because only one worldview will entail no essential contradiction. The truth is there's probably like 15, not thousands, but 15. And the Enlightenment was really useful to say, get rid of 972, but there's 18. And 18 is more than enough for World War III and more than enough to drive us crazy, right? So you end up, a big movement, and the great Joel Carini talks about this, a great movement in theology has been, and I think James K. Smith even points to this, is presuppositionalism, Van Til and different people, right? If you accept these presuppositions, the rest follows, right? That is an adequate and understandable response to the threat of postmodernity. because basically you're accepting the epistemology of postmodernity to defend yourself from it, right? That's what you're doing. You're saying, yes, there are different worldviews and there are different axioms, McAllister's, whose rationality. You know, you're accepting all of that and saying, well, yeah, okay, it's postmodern. There's no such thing as ultimate truth, modernity, a final absolute say. But that means our map is just as good as your map. And just because we have a map, you can't say from that fact alone that it's wrong, because all you have is a map too. So what Christian theology did in many circles is basically kind of, I don't want to, they accepted postmodernity in their defense from postmodernity. And that is not all wrong. But the problem is, it means discipleship in the church is simply about making sure you know the internal consistency, that you have all the right ideas, that you know the apologetics, that you have all of the answers to all of the weird things in the Bible, that your map is internally consistent, because it really is internally consistent. And if you're young, you just don't know that. And our job is to make sure that you know there are no essential contradictions in the Bible, et cetera, so forth, right? And that's the goal of the disciple. That's what the elder does. That's what preaching is all about. That's what ministry is about. Now, here's the issue, though. So, does Christianity tell you what to do with nuclear ethics? Does Christianity tell you, does the Bible tell you to do with the computer? Does the Bible tell you what to do regarding the problematic cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer might say, that happens in the churches, leading to that nihilism that you and Rossberg were talking about? Does the Bible give you, clear responses to these things? No, it doesn't. However, there are answers to these things in the spirit of the Bible, but it is not within simply the internal consistency of it, right? Because every map isn't the territory, right? It can't be, because if it was the territory, it would not be a map. It's your interpretation of the whole so that you make it intelligible. So there's a gap between the map and the territory, not because the map is wrong, but because humans are finite and we don't know everything. And there's no way for the Bible to have a direct answer on every possible technology or political circumstance that ever came into existence in all of history, because the book would be unreadable. And if that was the book that showed up 2,000 years ago that gave you all your answers on modern physics and everything, you know what would have happened? People would have looked at that book and said, it doesn't make any sense, and it wouldn't be here today. Right? It would have proved that God wrote it, I suppose, but it wouldn't have made it, because it wouldn't have made sense to anyone. It would have been nonsense to them. How could a book 2,000 years ago talk about drone ethics? People don't even know what drones are, dang it. So it wouldn't be with us, right? So by definition, it can't entail direct answers to all possible circumstances that will arise in all of history, but it can entail a certain orientation and spirit that in that consistency you can develop in to orientate your thinking in situations that are not directly talked about in the Bible. So this is what I call the Gödel point. The Gödel point, Kurt Gödel, incompleteness, it's where the map is not the territory. No map, this is the point. Think of it this way. No map can work if it is perfect. Like another way to look at it, George Bach says all models are wrong. All models are wrong, but some are useful. And a map is useful because it's wrong in a good way. It's wrong well. That's why you can use it. If it was a perfect model, it's useless because it's identical with the thing, right? So it's no good, right? You need a model that's wrong well. Wrong in a way, which is to say incomplete. You're not really wrong, but incomplete in a way that makes space for you to do your own thinking and to get in there to figure out how the map and the territory differ and yet are in the same spirit. That's what discipleship should be. That's what elders should be teaching you, is how to think in the Gödel point. How to think about things that you as a Christian face that are not self-evidently given to you by the scripture, but nevertheless the scripture provides resources for that lead to you having to make a decision that is usually a trade-off of competing goods. So I go back to that thing I said about filigree. So you got givens and releases, you need both, right? So one person may need 80% givens, a whole lot of structure, and 20% releases, less freedom. And another person may be the reverse, 20-80, right? A good elder would be able to discern which of those you are, that you're someone on the side and be able to minister to you in your particularity, because reality consists of uneven breakdowns that are situation based on your personality, who you are, and so on and so forth, right? Me simply teaching you the internal consistency of the Bible will not in of itself tell you how you should make decisions about your own personal life or how you should think about Christian ministry. You have to make a live decision in the spirit of the Bible. But you see, if Christianity is simply in the business of defending its internal consistency, not thinking the girdle point, then ministry, pastors, discipleship, there's not going to be any elders. I would argue elders are precisely those from their experience, because the only way to get a sense of proportionality is experience. You can't get that from abstract calculation. It has to come from experience by definition. They're to help you with that. If that's not there, you're not going to have the church doing that. And if the church isn't doing that, then people are not going to character formate in a manner that is going to be needed in order to relate to other people in a manner that reveals to them the abundance of friendship, conversations you get lost in, beauty, etc., so forth, right? So basically I'll bring it to that conversation with Ross. That was amazing. And, Ross is extraordinary. When you have an idea that, well, grace abounds, we don't have to worry about sin, and there's a kind of bypassing at it, then you're not wrestling. Here's the key. You're not wrestling with something that people don't know off the cuff how best to approach it. When is it right to publicly announce somebody's sin? When is it wrong to publicly announce their sin? To what degree should you do it? What is the adequate amount of time by which someone should be not allowed to join the leadership team, right? Does the Bible give you those answers? No. But the spirit of the Bible makes you wrestle with those questions. You see, we're scared. I think Christians are scared to acknowledge situations the Bible doesn't directly teach on because they think that means they're leaving the Bible behind. No, the whole reason you care about these problems is because of the Bible. So it's not leaving the Bible behind. It's because of the Bible that you care about these things the Bible does not directly speak on. But that seems to threaten sola scriptura, and now we're using our reason, not revelation, and we're making decisions, and you get lost. And so then people are going to bypass. They're just going to move beyond it quickly so we don't have to think these hard problems. I'll pause there.
Yes. And so, speaking to the first part, probably more difficult for me. Well, the apologetic kind of, that was what kind of broke down for me in this situation where like a mystical experience of something of an image that I got from, say, cartoons, that comes up in like the most dire situation related to this mythological story that I'm just now reading my 8-year-old son, and we're reading the comic book version of a Bible called I don't know. But what's crazy about that is like, there's something about the imagination that, an iconoclasm, it's through the lens of this guy and his art and all this kind of stuff, that is acknowledged. It's acknowledged, I can acknowledge that this is coming from a frame, but at the same time, like everything does.
Yes.
A pastor, a preacher, like it's all coming from, these frames. And so what became clear to me is that these stories, and Peterson brought this into a lot more clarity to help me understand this as I was trying to understand how a story thousands of years old does something and gives you wisdom, even in like an iconic image. And so then I'm watching Peugeot talk about like trying to understand that, like, how can that work even within your imagination or your subconscious or something like that. And we're into the spirit, as you said. Now we're into the metaphysics of these things working together. And I knew apologetics. I watched everything John Lennox put out. I watched everything that William Lane Craig was putting out, and it was all fascinating because that was also the framework in which culture was at. That's where everything was at. And so it was fascinating. But it did not, it wasn't an apology. It wasn't the answer of, is this a 6,000-year-old text or is this story 1,000,000 years old? Like, none of that mattered at that moment. And so that became a question walking through, what do you do with that? But then became this question of consequence and what do you do with healing? What do you do with spiritual healing? What do you do with beginning to understand, having to quote unquote really look at my identity or my identities? Oh, worship leader, pastor, husband, father, Christian, son-in-law, like all these identities, like, and what seems appropriate. It would be nice to let yourself off the hook. Oh, this person, oh, Christian, we just want to see restoration. We just want to see restoration. And I'm kind of like, I don't even feel like I want to see that kind of restoration in my own life. And so that could have been, I could have gone back to something, but I knew it had, that identity was too big a part of me that I can just go back into that same framework and everything emotionally be okay, spiritually be okay. And a lot of times, like, there's pragmatics at play, like, oh, well, we sure could use another guitar player, like, or something, and these are, it seems trivial in the grand scheme of trying to think about these things, but they're ever present. Pastors and people that we're supposed to trust, right now. So the pastor from Gateway went to prison recently, or jail, in a large charismatic church in Dallas area, I think. And you know what? Who do we got? We got to get who's the guy that got in his interim? Max Lucado. We got to get another name to come up and protect, and we can look at, like, now we can look at this person, and we emotionally can be okay about our situation. He has a resume, he has books, he's been faithful where this guy has not been. And but, like, what is this sackcloth and ashes? What is it also that you had judges that were discerning the law in a situation? Not, it wasn't just, and questions of, I just go back to, for whatever reason, it was just like Matthew 7, Jesus is dealing with wolves in sheep's clothing.
Yep.
Greater, it would be better to have a millstone tied around your neck than to mislead these children. Or what does it mean to take planks out of your eye versus, these are all questions of judgment and discernment.
Yes, they are.
And and this whole, who am I to judge? Oh, it could have been me. Oh, but like, that all just kind of flew out the window, but it's not. I want to know if there's somebody who it's not been. I need an elder that's not anxious because they feel like that could be them. And that's like the type of nihilism that seemed pervasive. And it's like, and so I'm just, I use this term, but I'm kind of priesthood of the believering my way through that situation. And so all this stuff related to eldership, related to a pastor, a shepherd, like all those, like, what is a shepherd doing? Like, what is that? What is the role of a shepherd? It's very, that's a concrete idea, actually. And so, but again, these also come into conflict with ideas of scale, ideas of the market, ideas of metrices, and all these types of things that are it's just easy to just, all of a sudden I'm in that lane. All of a sudden that, it's this pragmatic, all of a sudden it's, bottom line, all these things. And it holds very little water for me related to ecclesiology at this point.
That was also well put. So you want to learn your map. If you grant me the language of map as internally consistent system, presuppositional event, etc. And also, to the problem with presupposition, in my opinion, like what Van Til describes as people learn in Christian theology with presuppositionalism. The problem is that that just describes everyone. It's not just Christians that have presuppositions. Communists, Muslims, atheists, everyone. Presuppositionalism is simply the description of all ideological formation, because all ideological formation must assume first principles to define what is rational and what is logical according to its first principles, right? So the problem is treating presuppositionalism as a special case, when really it simply describes the formation of all worldviews and doesn't tell you how you should relate to those other worldviews, nor does it tell you what to do at the point where the internal consistency has nothing to say. Not because it can't give you an inspiration for your judgment about what to do, but it cannot give you a procedure for what to do step by step, right? So also too, to say something provocative, basically the reason why free market libertarian capitalism doesn't work and lead to all these troubles is it conflates rational and right. It conflates that what is most rational is best. That's a problem. If I think the example I always give is that if you think it's going to rain today, it becomes rational to bring an umbrella, right? But let's say it doesn't rain. Does that mean you are irrational? No, you were very rational relative to what you thought was going to occur. It just turns out you were wrong. Therefore, it is possible to be rational and wrong. Oh, shoot. So when they say the market is always rational, absolutely. Too bad rational doesn't mean right. The market can be very rational and wrong. And it turns out that right and wrong are not defined by rational. Your idea of right and wrong determines what is rational and must come before the question of what is rational. And you determine right and wrong by a moral vision, by what you think is true, which is non-rational, not irrational, but non-rational. Non-rationality makes rationality possible, which means before you define what is efficient, rational, right, etc., so forth, you have to have a vision of how the world works. And that is not arrived at by rationality alone. It is arrived at by embedded myth, mystical, emotion, relationship, right? So if you remove all of those things and just simply have people being rational, then what you're saying is that the truth of which is rational to worship is isolation, mechanics, efficiency, and that's why the logic of capital is the logic of artificial intelligence, as Mikey and Nick Land and all of these people say, right? It is. And I actually think it goes back to Mary Douglas, How Institutions Think, and other things. But you want to, so to go what you were saying on the eldership, and that also all points to why basically a certain recovery, I think a certain recovery of Russell Kirk in particular would be very useful, because he argues conservatism, he argues that conservatism is primarily a defense of imagination versus ideology, and that and also to say another thing that has to put meat on the bone, the conservative defense of small government is not for the sake primarily of unleashing small business or entrepreneurs, although that's all good and dandy. It's because small community births imagination.
Yeah.
You birth imagination in a particular place, with a particular people. Flannery O'Connor, like great novels are particular. They're specific. Imagination is birthed by a particular river with a particular grandmother in a particular town with a particular character. You destroy small towns. The problem isn't primarily that now there's no small businesses and corporations take over. Yeah, that's part of it. That's not great because that leads to all sorts of pathologies. But the conservative has made a terrible mistake, in my opinion, which I actually think speaks to the death of liberalism, because it has also not made this argument. The conservative, and I'm not saying the conservative is right and the liberal is wrong. I'm just saying that the conservative doesn't know what they are and simply was conflated with libertarianism in problematic ways to no longer usefully add to the political conversation, because the conservative primarily defended small government and small business for the sake of unleashing the market, because big government destroys the market, blah, blah, blah. That's easily true. I mean, there's lots of arguments to show that actually does tend to occur. Now, it's more nuanced, but you see, the problem is you're defending community for market reasons, as opposed to defending community is because robust communities are where imaginations are born. And when humans don't have imaginations, they don't tend to be very human. So re-establishing the conversation about defending the local and the particular and the small for the sake of defending wounds that birth the imagination is the argument that people need to make, because imagination is it's from which moral vision arises. And if we don't have robust imaginations, then we're not going to have robust understandings of the truth. And then the rationality that follows from our truth will not be our own. And what will be efficient is that which leads us out of ourselves into something that isn't us. And that's
the urban monoculture.
Yes, the urban monoculture, as the Collins put it. That's exactly what occurs. So on the elder discipleship thing, the point of a map, you want to learn your map well. So you want to learn your map. So this is where, to defend apologetics and to defend exegesis, you need to learn your map to find where the girdle point is.
Yeah.
You need your map to know where it's not the territory, not so you can say, I don't need to care about the territory, but so you can know well where it's not the territory and to have informed judgments about what's not the map that are well. So you want to learn your map so you can judge what's not the territory well, right? And what is the places where your map ends, you want to be able to judge that well. So the elder, what they know the map, they've learned the apologetics, they've done the studies really well to inform their discernment about that of which the Bible does not directly speak on, or to discern your situation or to help you think through, right? The Bible is all about discernment and judgment. We've made a massive, massive mistake to conflate judgment and judgmentalism. Yeah. Another way we've put it is there's a difference, if you grant me this language, there's a big difference between saying you are a liar, as in your essence is lying, versus saying you lied. You lied is just a statement of what occurred. It's an assessment, right? Well, people think that saying you lied is the same as saying you are a liar, right? No, the Christian is not supposed to judge someone's essence as sin, but you're absolutely supposed to judge when sin occurred. Like if somebody lied and you deny it, you're in non-reality, and actually it's irresponsible to the congregation. And one of those, the thing I can remember Ross said that it was really a great metaphor is when you're running a church and you have responsibility, you're driving a car where it's a car wreck that could hurt 1 million people. Exactly right. How would you drive differently if you took seriously that you could be in a car wreck that killed 1 million people? That's freaking right. Exactly right. But because so you have to discern and you have to judge. And here's the other thing. The only way to defend your moral life and to have a moral vision that then maintains the human being is by definition going to require discernment and judgment. This is where we're being replaced by the machine. This is where we're not. This is where using the machine is good for social coordination. This is when it's dopamine. If you can't make those judgments, the machine wins. The urban monocle, by definition, if you can't judge, you lose. So you have to be able to judge, but the key is to judge. Here's the issue. To judge to open relationality is very different to judge to cut off relationality. When I said you lied, that means I care about you. When I say you are a liar, that means I want nothing to do with you. That's the difference. Now, of course, you can use those phrases interchangeably, but you get what I'm getting at, right? Yeah. When I tell you lied, that means I want to relate to you. When I say you are a liar, I'm saying goodbye, right? Yeah. Well, if you don't tell that person they lied when they did, you're actually saying, I don't want to relate to you. I want to relate to my image of you. I want to relate to the phantasm. I want to relate to the simulacra. Well, that's just the logic of the machine in other forms, right? The dopamine and pleasurable. So it is extremely important to understand that when the Bible is saying, do not judge so that you would not be judged, it is in terms of judgmentalism. It is not discernment. But you see, here's the issue. Basically, following Aristotle, and Joachim will talk about this, judgment in a very real way is the highest intellectual act. It is the most difficult. It actually is to make choices well. And Forrest Landry emphasizes this, is the point of education, is to know how to make choices, know how to discern, not certification and knowing. We think education is learning a technical skill, right? So you can, to know how to follow a procedure to make money and so on and so forth. No, the point is actually so you can make good choices, which by definition requires judgment and discernment. But that's where the map isn't the territory. This is the issue. If it was, you wouldn't need judgment. You could just follow the consistency and logic of the map, right? So when you're dealing with things where the map isn't the territory, like a particular circumstance in a particular time with Christian Baxter or Daniel Garner in 2025 that has particular variables and particular people involved with different emotional dispositions, that all requires discernment. And that requires being able to think a whole lot of vectors and dimensions all at the same time, and then help the person make a choice without at the same time helping them in a manner that helps them avoid their responsibility, right? That's all discernment. That's all judgment. That's all what you need to step into do. And apologetics being really good at apologetics does not mean you're really good at that, right? But if our only understanding of Christian education is to be good at apologetics, then we don't have a part of it that's going to be training this discernment and judgment. So then, of course, people are going to bypass. Because what's happening is basically those situations that you described before, and then I'll throw it back at you, and I don't know where the time goes. What ends up happening in a situation like that is it's existential. It makes the church face a certain existential tension. It's like, we don't know what to do with this because we actually don't know how to think being Christian beyond simply maintaining the consistency of the theology or the consistency of our beliefs. We don't know how to think live decision. We don't know how to situationally reason, and we don't want to. And we have a theology of Christ where he died on the cross to forgive us of our sins. And if we don't quickly forgive people, aren't we not being Christ-like? And you've got a salvation and you're doomed.
Yeah, that existential thing is, forgive us our debts or forgive us our sins as we forgive those, forgive us our trespasses, and it's like, I think I brought this up in that conversation, but it was like, I have the Spirit of Christ, but I am not Christ. like it, and maybe greater things you will do than I did or something, so you have these back and forth, but at the same time, it's like, forgiveness is a process that takes time for us. It's sometimes maybe supernaturally but we want to be like, why supernaturally can free. And again, you're choosing to be deluded in thinking that, or on the flip side, as you mentioned earlier, people can take advantage of that simple reality and say, no, I'm the biggest sinner here. You've got to forgive me. Actually, I've seen that. That was also birthed the context of where I'm coming from. Is another part of a story related to church for us that I don't talk about a whole lot on here, but that it is defined by a betrayal from a pastor, not myself, to me in our marriage. And so, and that happened in multiple times, but the most recent time that was used as a cudgel. And so, it's like, yet here I am. How do I get away from? So then it's like, well, that's usually where people walk away from the church. That's usually where people are done, right? And because, but what's so interesting is it came back. What a big part of that was like, are we gonna create this drama? Are we gonna try to like hold on to this thing actually that we cherish and that we in many ways were healed, in this place, this community, this church? And what the image that came to mind was like, well, the two mothers with Solomon, which again, we're talking again about judgment. We're talking again about a situation. It's like, do I try to hold on to this thing and it get torn apart and tear it apart? Or do I let go and, that and walk away? And it was the latter. But to the other part about usually that betrayal is where you'd be like, well, this whole project's bullshit or something like that. Well, then what do I do with that mythic, archetypal, metaphysical experience given to me by a very specific story embedded inside of this structure? And it was like, I can't walk away from that either. So, and it's actually what I want to give my children. And so, oh, well, then the Orthodox have it figured out. Just go to the Orthodox. Oh, the Catholics have it figured out. You just go to the Cat. I'm like, I don't. Maybe I'm just not that naive, at this point. Not that there isn't beauty there, not that there isn't wisdom there, not that there isn't truth there that I am actually hungry for. So, anyways, it's the personal for me. I'm not a great reader. I'm not, but these things become true in our lives and people write about them because they are true and probably likely were true in their own lives as the authors. Maybe it's theoretical, but that can be the case too. But go ahead.
No. If you don't, there's a few things. If you don't have an incarnational theology, you're going to get a grace nihilism. And that's what keeps happening. If you don't have this kind of understanding that God is making all creation new and he cares about 2025 and it actually in its particularity needs to be honored in the spirit of the person of Jesus in the Bible, but not the spirit, the life of Jesus in Bible over 2025, like bulldozering it, because basically then it's sort of a, well, it's, the horror of it is actually it's actually the Marxist logic of fungibility hidden in theology, where you're like, basically every year it's the same thing. Just get back to Jesus. 2025, 1998, it's all fungible, which is the logic of the market, which is the logic of capital exchange. So you basically are saying creation is fungibility, which I would argue the logic of fungibility is actually the opposite of incarnational theology, because you're saying people are interchangeable. Everything is interchangeable. It's and the logic of interchangeability is $20 or whatever, right? So if you can actually take sola scriptura, if you're not careful, and basically make reality fungible. And this is the opposite of incarnation. So you end up with a certain nihilism, and you were saying that before also.
Well, and that led me to a sacramental ontology.
Yes,
ultimately, yes. And so that. And I didn't really have some words for it, but even in moving into these philosophical spaces and having, like, that's where, again, like I look at, and Paul uses this language talking about evangelicalism being more like a marketplace in general, just like, and if you can kind of almost allow that in a sense, like I think that there's actually, like you were saying, how do you discern between where's the machine and where's all this, like, it's almost like that needs to be acknowledged in a really real, instead of it being like, because this is also something I dealt with when I had a ministry, and I was like, okay, however the Lord wills, I'll get a phone call to be called, and I'll go lead worship at this place. And I'm watching this other evangelist that I work with a lot, like he's running this thing like a freaking business.
Yes.
Oh, but it's the Lord's work.
It's the Lord's work.
And I was like, oh, no, and so then I get online and I start doing this stuff again. I was like, okay, there's a version of this that I do need to just approach, that it's in a marketplace. I'm going to turn on memberships and people can pay to support this. Yeah. I'm not going to like try to repress that shadow. I'm going to say this is a reality of this space, but it's also not going to be the driver. But if I don't do that, then it's going to be in my subconscious, or it's going to be in my conscious, working on me. So, but to this other point of like, I'll just use this as an example. Maybe I don't know how to, like all these ideas, somebody, Jonathan Peugeot, has distilled into, I'm going to aim this at fairy tale storytelling and trying to give this back into the culture in a very specific way. I'm Eastern Orthodox, or I'm Orthodox, and I've got these things, but where is the market to sell quote unquote Christian merchandise? It's Big Eva. It's this large marketplace. And so I'm going to go to the Touchstone conference and sell my books. I'm going to go to Midwest Estuary, like, but Eastern Orthodox is so much, I'm not saying this about him, but I'm saying this kind of in the mimetic culture. Yeah. Mm-hmm. The Eastern Orthodox is so much above, it's so transcendent, it's so sacred that, that we can't, no, that doesn't work either, where they have a relationship because I'm trying to pay these things off or make this successful within the market. I have to go to the evangelicals. I have to go to the homeschool people. I have to go to the mega church people. So there's something happening there. So I watched that pattern take place. And I think that, like, again, like this conversation of market, like a realism related to this, as opposed to some kind of simulacrum or some kind of, oh no, it's the Lord. Like, it's like, you're a really good entrepreneur. You're way better at sales than whoever. I'm not talking about Jonathan at this point. I'm just saying in general, and so that's another piece of it. Like, oh, look, I just don't like that term. Look at what the Lord's doing. And it's an entrepreneurial endeavor. I just, that kind of grosses me out in a certain way, because like, we can take responsibility. No, you're actually really good at this, and that's why this is successful in a certain way. But we, that's how if you want to measure it by, aggregate matrices. And so it's like, so that's one piece of that. And the other piece about, I think, what was the second thing you brought into that conversation? So we talked about the market, but again, like this, okay, so going to the sacramental ontology, which is that marketplace is in certain ways like an abstraction too. And whenever the churches are using marketing as the actual experience as a market, like and I mean, that just takes me, unfortunately, to to Christ with the whip. But it's like, and so where sacramentalism is tying the incarnation to a practice and to a relationship to that practice, and it's taking place in a kind of a unconscious level in certain ways, because, and again, this goes back to where we started this conversation, a point that I made about the telos of worship. If it can actually be, I'll use quotes, but Christ, and it's the reason I use quotes because of it's because of the different theologies related to sacramentalism, and so it's like where that lands on that level. I'm not sure it matters. I know that sounds, that's a bold statement, as much as like what we're doing with our attention, what we're doing with our care, and what we're doing with our embodied practice within liturgy that way, because, and if that is consciously more important than the market, that changes where on your value hierarchy. Is there a market? Yes. Can we acknowledge that? Yes. Should we participate in some ways? Yes. Is it okay to balance a budget, operating? Yeah, that doesn't go away, but it doesn't end up being at the highest point of your value hierarchy. But if we're just unconsciously moving through that market thinking that this is quote unquote church, this is quote unquote ministry, we're just shaped by it, like I think you've said. And so I'll let you have the last word as we're kind of winding down our time here today. Oh no, we're frozen. Let's see. We're still going here. It'll come back. I believe in it. Oh no. Did he accidentally? Here, hold on. And okay, we're back going.
Wonderful. Like, there's a funny thing where if I have to tell you it's the Lord's work, it's failed. Like, it should simply be full of the light of the Lord's work, right? It's me like telling you this is good art. It's not now, right? Like, it has to kind of have that. But you see, that's part of the existential nervousness of being like, well, I have to justify this. I have to justify markets. I have to justify making money, right?
No, we paused again. Oh no. It's struggling to close us out here. I don't know if it's me or you. I don't see I'm not getting a bad internet sign here. I have to get it going. Okay. So yeah. Last word here.
Yeah.
No. No.
Yeah. So there is always this idea, like if I have to say it's the Lord's work, it's the Lord's work. Like you see in Protestantism, actually, Protestantism, because this gets into the question of like the three, like you were saying, it's like, well, because there's been this idea of, well, if I became a Catholic, then I'd be good. If I became an Orthodox, then I'd be good, right? Or vice versa. Well, I'm just of the opinion that the theopolitical comes for all three of them, and all three of them don't have the answers for the theopolitical that are proper for our moment. And so therefore, no matter what church you go to, we don't have a response to the theopolitical. So think that really well, because basically the theopolitical showed up for Protestantism, eradicated it. It just shows up and there's a lack of resources. And I understand also the massive appeal of orthodoxy. But orthodoxy also is going to have to answer the theopolitical in terms of politics. And the temptation is like, well, I don't want to think the political. I don't want to think the economic. I totally get it, but it's coming for you. AI is coming, and your congregation has to make decisions about AI. And you could say that to say something, I'd have to explain. There's a way in which Protestantism is an attempt to deal with if you grant me this, it's trying to deal with the political problem of diversity without.
I would grant it to you, but we are struggling with signal.
is trying to meet people kind of in particularity, in diversity, and there are many, many, many different churches that form, right? So Protestantism is an attempt to really maintain difference and unity, and it ends up also being much more involved in, let me put it this way, Protestantism tries to enter political and in economic spaces and influence them. Catholicism more so with, say, the Holy Roman, and this is all a vast characterization, so granted. Catholicism has more so tried to make alternative political economic structures alongside the state, you know, the two swords in the Protestant Reformation, the earth and sky and different things. Orthodoxy has more tried to master the monasteries on the side of the road that have an influence on people with a certain kind of faithful presence, right? All three of those provide wisdoms for approaching the theopolitical. The Protestant has not figured out how to go into the political and the economic without being trained into habits that remove it from its ability to not think in terms of quantification, fungibility, et cetera, so forth. And it's also not been able to do it without basically taking the theology and shrinking it down to the Roman road, because it's the most efficient way. And if you're moving and you're talking with a bunch of different people, because let me also put it this way. If the Protestant goes into the Pentagon, then I have to be able to efficiently kind of educate everyone there about Protestantism, right? So I'm going to probably have a salvation message. I'm going to do the Roman road. I'm going to really focus on, you know, kind of that idea of theology that I think everyone in the evangelical world grew up with. And there's just kind of this sense of a lack of nuance, right? You know, I have to kind of bring it. So I'm going to condense. If I'm more of a Catholic and you come into the church, then you're already open to things. The very act of you stepping into kind of suggests a transformation and an openness. So I don't have to compress as much. And in fact, I can just keep doing the Mass in Latin and you'll just have to go with it, right? Like you don't have to really understand everything that's going on because you've already stepped in, right? But if I'm a Protestant and I'm more going into, everything I present has to, on the onset, be pretty understandable or it's going to be kicked out, right? Orthodoxy, of course, is more on the side of the Catholic. It's more kind of coming in. And it's also very much part of that. And you could kind of say the Catholic is more of the in-between because clearly lots of Catholics go into political forms. You could say Protestant is more extreme on that. And as you slide over to the Orthodox, you're going to be more of the monastery that's on the side, right? All three of those have failed. All three of those are inadequate because there's some sort of all three of those. All of that has to be thought, and perhaps is the meta-gelical discussion. Okay, and it's the meta-gelical discussion, and it's the problem. I think it is strongly tied to this issue of imagination. So so that was all a very crude, overly general understanding of Protestantism. One of the reasons people itself in going into those things, like that's a reason people are so upset with the Protestant because it kind of went into these things. But at the same time, you have to see a certain sort of like courage in that, a certain sort of like, well, we're not, you know, we're going to go meet people where they are in their particular governments. We're not going to tell everyone they need to have a Catholic government structure or Catholic social programs or what to do in their moral life. We're going to actually try to make a federalist system that makes space for difference. We're going to actually try to, we're going to try to create the conditions. You're going to actually try to more so as a Protestant create conditions of freedom because you kind of believe that people need to have some degree of freely choosing or showing the difference in their freedom, right? So that's going to change your theopolitical structure. All of that needs to be built on what Protestantism does indeed need is a sacramental theology. That is what's been deeply hurting it. A sacramental ontology, incarnational theology, plus going into institutions and also being able to resist being formed by the liturgies of those institutions into habits that take us out of the ability to offer a new moral imagination. That's the challenge for now, right?
Yeah.
I think also to close, although I've really enjoyed this and don't know where it all went. So there's a few things I'll just say last. Philip Rieff warned that if you're young, and this is why kind of Rieff was talking about Freud a lot. What Philip Rieff warned is that in Jung, you create the temptation of people finding. So that's kind of a general way to look at kind of the Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic kind of different relations to culture, and how I think basically Protestantism plus a sacramental ontology. And I think that creativity is also a really big part of that. So, and I do think also the way that the Catholic approaches the ritual, you could even say like, you know, the book, The Theology of the Body, John Paul II, taking sex, family seriously. That's also another piece that the Protestant fell, well, and maybe it did start with sex, actually. That would be interesting to trace out. The Protestant fell into the mistake of kind of saying those are private choices. They don't have communal impact, which you could argue is true to a certain degree. But then that leads to private sin, not communal impact too, right? So you get into all of those problems. And the Catholic has had, I think, at least perhaps from in a John Paul sense, more of a sense that what we think are private decisions are not private decisions. Now, maybe, you know, obviously birth control is the big one, right? So the idea is like, you know, if your neighbor is using birth control and you're not, then maybe you're an idiot because you're irresponsible, right? But if everyone is not allowed to use birth control, then I cannot think of it as possibly irresponsible not to use it, right? It changes the meaning of your decision. Your neighbor can't use birth control without it changing the meaning of you not using it, right? Or vice versa, et cetera, so forth, right? And that was the Catholic theology, I do think, now this would have to be justified. They may have had a better understanding of the social impact of individual choices than Protestantism. And that's something also that has to be learned. Now, the last thing I was saying on archetypes, well, actually not the last thing, but I know, you know, Philip Reeve warned his critique of Carl Jung, and I actually think we've seen this play out with Peterson. And, you know, Cadell obviously says that Peterson doesn't move from religion to absolute knowing in Hegel's phenomenology. But what that means exactly, we can discuss. It's the theopolitical. But what Philip Reeve said is that the problem with archetypes is it can end up in everyone having their own private religion of their archetype and their own private sanctification and their own private character development. And his concern of that is that, well, that's pure release then. Your archetype doesn't actually restrain you because you choose how to interpret your archetype, and any restraint it puts on you is actually an expression of your individuality. So it's a fake constraint. Like it becomes a fake constraint. And the same can happen with personality types, INTP. It's like, well, you know, I'm an INTJ and I'm just really nervous around people and that's my constraint. Well, you can actually just use that to identify yourself to avoid the other person, right? So it's not really a constraint because you gamify that constraint, right? So Philip Reeve was very concerned about that. Also, the other thing he's concerned about is that this is what I would say, and I think he would agree with this, or at least is pointing to it in his, you know, books like Charisma. Archetypes, you know how you can address your archetype? Go to war, World War III. You know, you can like fulfill your destiny by unreleased themos, as, you know, Plato talk about logos, eros, and themos. Archetypes could just basically, archetypes alone don't. It's a very thymotic sort of spirit, right? So, you know, to say, so basically the issue is that the archetype, if that's all you emphasize, you can identify your archetype as themos, recognition, battle, warrior. And there's something about Nick Fuentes. It's like, you know, this is just who we are. There's a kind of archetypical assertion in that, right? And the problem is basically, and Reeve was an atheist, but he kind of admitted this. He's like, archetypes actually become very dangerous if they're not rooted in some sort of sacred order. Ergo a religion, right? Because ultimately then archetypes simply become political forces that are unbound and become very, very dangerous. And that's something that Reeve was very, very concerned about.
I mean, there's a lot there, but just to put a bow on it is just that the word, when I was talking to Jordan Hall at Midwest Estuary, and some of the concerns I had related to the machine within these forces, and he mentioned the word techno-theocracy.
Yes.
And what I kind of developed a counter, and I think it really goes well because you keep talking about the theopolitical, but you also have been very direct in talking about the economic force or the market forces related. And the word that kind of came to me after that conversation with him was, and even in that the atheist guy that you just mentioned, talking about a sacred order, was something like a sacrotheonomy, actually. Mm-hmm. And that's been a framework in which, and it, you know, it's obviously influenced, or I don't know, obviously, but John Vervaeke's, you know, the advent of the sacred and in our culture, and even in Protestant spaces. I will say, I think that Protestantism has the tools to reclaim a sacramental ontology,
Yes.
at least with the ones that have a theological framework, or slightly, you know, some of the Baptists are flirting with it, going back to their confessional roots. But you know, those are all pieces at play that I'm interested in and related to these conversations. But Daniel, thank you so much for meeting me here on Yours Truly today, and I look forward to continuing to have collaboration and conversation in these spaces we find ourselves in 2025, almost 2026.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed it. I mean, the last thing I'll say is I agree. The resources are there in Protestantism. I think, you know, Keller, once speaking about the Lord's Prayer, and Martin Luther pointed this out when he says, "Give us this day our daily bread." You know, the idea is, well, then God uses the bread maker, right? So there's the potential for a sacramental ontology. The last thing I guess I'll point to as kind of a provocative claim is this entire time we have been suggesting that economics without a human element, a moral order, something that cannot be quantified, eats itself. It goes into the machine, AI, et cetera, so forth. A lot of people may hear that and say, well, that's nice and all, but the truth is that, you know, is just kind of special pleading, right? Like, you know, a lot of people may kind of hear what we're saying about the need for the human, and they might say, well, that's all nice and all, but markets are rational. They're the most efficient. And you know, what all of you guys are saying is just kind of pleading, right? You're just kind of pleading for the involvement of the human being, but that's not how the world works. You know, et cetera, so forth. One of the things I just think is just very, very important is when you look at the history of capitalism, like the Dijsselmeer-Mikulski Great Enrichment, it wasn't because there was an explosion of everyone being rational or quantifying. It was because there was an explosion of imagination and possibilities and conversation culture. Robert Solow in The Solar Residue points out that you can't explain where all GDP comes from if you simply look at commodity flow, like money, liquidity, markets. There's much more to be said, but basically the funny argument I would like to make is that the success of capitalism actually has always come thanks to our great enrichment, has actually been this explosion of something that is human, that's not quantifiable. That's when all the great enrichments came. That's when all the great innovations came, when there was an emphasis on sacramental theology. And so what this all means is that my argument would be that the very enrichment of capitalism, when it was very successful, we think that's evidence that quantity works, machine works, and it makes us all very rich. Actually, that follows after an explosion of something that is fundamentally human and strong community. Moral imagination generates wealth. Moral imagination generates the machine that generates wealth. And what has happened is we've forgotten that. So then in the name of generating wealth, we've lost sight of creativity, the human and moral imagination, thinking that will make us wealthier, when in fact it's the complete opposite. Removing that makes us poorer. Actually, capitalism can't even be itself without the immoral imagination. It suffers auto-cannibalism. It eats itself. And that's a really important economic history to recover. Because if you recover that, and I think you can even look at Cole Planier, like, you know, because people think, well, the reason capitalism won is because everyone was rational, right? They all saw that it was better, it was more efficient, and they were convinced to do it. No, Cole Planier shows that people were forced into the markets. They were forced into the cities. They didn't want to do it. They wanted to keep their communities. It wasn't rational to them at all. Same goes with the book on fallen grace, lost grace in the North after the Civil War. It wasn't that everyone said the machine was rational. Everyone, like people with robust moral imagination, were like, we don't like the trade-off. We don't agree with the trade-off. And to the degree that history has been forgotten, and that the human with their moral imagination has not had a say, they've had their moral imagination done for them by the system, the more inequality has grown, the more stagnation has grown, the more wealth has dried up. In the name of making us all rich, we've removed the conditions of possibility for enrichment. And so everything that we're actually discussing is economically radically practical in that regard, because the recovery of the moral vision is that of which enables practice. I've really enjoyed this. I don't know where the time went. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you, Daniel. It's been awesome, man. And thanks for everyone sticking around with us today. All right, we'll end this thing backstage. All right, dude.
Well, that was fun.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.